Well, good evening, everyone. Just some points of order. First of all, well, welcome everyone to our meeting. We haven't had an audit and transparency meeting since February. And obviously we are doing this virtually now. Hopefully we'll be back together in September. We shall see. To start off, I would like to make an apology. I got told off this time last year by Councillor Dencode for not providing drinks and snacks at the end of year meeting, and I'm afraid now I've got a valid excuse for not providing drinks. And I promise I will provide drinks and snacks at the next meeting when we are present.
Very good.
No, that serious point of order is done. Membership. So we welcome Councillor David Lindsay joining the committee, taking over as vice chair, and a very big welcome to Liz and Cosette, who are two co-opted members who are joining us. And it's been obviously a long process to get them into a meeting. I think we did the interviews in January. We announced them in March, and obviously our June meeting was pushed out until July. So thank you very much, Liz and Cosette. It's wonderful to have you on board.
Thank you very much. Welcome it, yes.
Good. We have no apologies for absence. We are all here and present. Declarations of interest from anyone on the committee?
None. I have none.
None. Moving on to A4, the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of February 2020. Is everyone happy that I can virtually sign these minutes? Any comments? Raise it, say, oh, hold on, we've got a raised hand. Liz, is that a raised hand?
Yep, yes, it is.
Liz, go for it.
Yeah, it's just a very small point. When you say in A8, internally funded insurance program, is that sort of self-insured?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
From my recollection, a portion of it was self-insured, yeah.
Okay, fine. And then on A9, is this the draft internal audit plan? Because it's PwC and Mazars and not Grant Thornton. And whether or not that draft had been recirculated, because it was to be recirculated before the June meeting, but I can't recall having seen anything.
Yeah. Is Moira on the line, or is David?
Yeah, happy to pick that up for you, Chair. So PwC and Mazars, as well as our in-house team, comprise the internal audit function for RBKC. So we use a mixture of in-house and external capacity to deliver the audit plan. So as you're probably aware, with the lockdown that came into force at the end of March, we've had to reassess the audit plan. We're in the process of doing that now to look at which pieces of work we can progress, where new pieces of work have emerged which we need to undertake in the second half of the year. But effectively for the first sort of 3 months of the year, we'd paused any audit work apart from closing off 1920 audits to enable the organisation to deal with the emergency situation. In fact, many of our internal audit team have actually been helping in terms of the emergency response as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Andrew, raised hand.
Yes, it's just a factual thing, perhaps Martin to check. Last page, I think Ian Luder joined the committee when I did, which was either 2005 or 6. Ian was a member of the committee and he stood down for a year when he was Lord Mayor of London and came back again. So I can't remember. I think I was joining in 2005 or 4, 5 or 6 it was. So, but it wasn't 8.
Okay, so we chopped 3 years of service off him.
Well, yes, and I think just for Martin.
Yes.
Check.
Martin, would we be able to amend that?
Yes, I'll check that, Chair, and amend.
And
yes.
Tell me, how do I sign this?
If you give your approval now over the remotely, then I will make sure that you are sent a hard copy for signature.
Great. Then, so I think it's my approval once that date is updated.
Okay.
So everyone else is happy. No more hands. Great. Right. So moving on to the draft statement of accounts. Is Mike Curtis on the line?
Hi, Chair. Sorry, it's Tara. So Mike gives his apologies today. So I'm covering a couple of items on his behalf.
Okay.
Is that okay? Yep. Okay. Thank you, Chair. So presented to the committee tonight are the draft accounts for 2019-20. They were published on the 18th of June. So just to highlight that, although the deadline for publication has been extended as a result of COVID, we at Kensington and Chelsea were very keen to continue with our original timetable as planned. So 2 reasons for that. I think one is a very practical reason. So our finance team have been working at home throughout the lockdown, and actually all of this work could continue as planned. But also we're in for a bit of a tricky couple of years financially, and there's a report under A7. So we were very keen to make sure that actually we close our accounts as soon as possible so we can start to focus on future years. So the accounts have now been transferred to the external auditors, and I know that GT are on the line and those works have started. Very, very short covering report to accompany the lengthy statement of accounts, which is in line with statutory guidance. There's a number of recommendations that we've set out in the report, and in particular 3 notes that we've just drawn your attention to. So I think certainly the accounts is quite a lengthy document. I wasn't going to say much else, but I was going to open to questions. I've also got my colleague Lubna Nasir on the line, so between us we'll try and make sure that we can cover all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Taryn. Questions, please raise your hands. Councillor Denko.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to thank Taryn and Lubna. I had a chat with them earlier. The statement of accounts is in a slightly different format to what it used to be when I used to, when I was on Audit Transparency before, and I used to go through it. And I had half an hour with them earlier today, so I didn't have to ask 29 questions. So thank you to them. I've got about 5. Shall I just fire them off, or shall I do them one by one? What would you like, Chair?
Well, Tara's going to be answering them, so Tara, what would you prefer?
Okay, thank you. I'll just, I mean, they're fairly short, okay. Really. And one thing is, page 8, I'm always amazed by the number of directors we have. We have 3 times more than them. That's just something that we have to think about. I don't know. Page 17, there's this issue about underspends going into reserves, and we used to have endless debates with Warwick Lightfoot about this, because it's the same money that goes into reserves that we're then not allowed to use to boost the budget. I know we've now avoided that by having our budget stabilization reserve, which we haven't had access to take money out of. We haven't needed to do that yet. I think obviously that's a better idea. I do hope we're actually going to do that, especially next year. We've got quite a bit of money in the budget stabilization reserve, but we always had this battle over putting underspends into reserves, which we then weren't allowed to use for anything else. That's a point rather than a question, sorry. Let me see. So there's those 2 points, and I wanted to ask, this is probably for you, Chair, which is who is responsible for overseeing the implementation of the Charter for Public Participation and the Hillsborough Charter, both of which we've signed up to? Is that us, or is that some different committee or select committee? I'm really not sure.
Who is in charge of the implementation of it?
Who is overseeing implementation? Who would actually be auditing whether or not we're doing it, basically?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that, but I can find the answer out and report back.
Okay. That's my main points, really. And it's this thing about the reserve, particularly, that I would welcome some comments on, please.
Yeah. So thank you. And if I can, so I think there was a couple of comments there which I've definitely jotted down, and I also don't know the answer to your question around the public participation charter, so we can certainly find that out and come back to you. So in terms of you've referenced the underspend and kind of in particular the reserve, so we did end the year with an underspend of 11.3 million. So that was mainly focused around three main areas. So there's a very small amount that went into the car parking reserve, about 350,000. So that's because that is specifically earmarked. So any surplus income that we make on parking does need to go into that reserve. The remaining amount has gone into the stabilisation reserve. There are three main reasons for that underspend. The first is around our treasury management strategy. So we've actually borrowed less last year, but also achieved more investment income. So that's one of the areas. The second area was around we were holding a budget for a pension fund liability, whereas actually I know it's not part of this committee, but we do know that generally our pension fund is well funded. So we didn't require that provision. And the third one, which was one typically we always underspend on, is around our corporate contingency. So I always say that if you budget right through the year, actually your contingency is really for unforeseen events. So there was an underspend on there. So the major part of the underspend was in relation to those three areas. Services as a whole broadly broke even, so that's a good sign because that means we're broadly getting our budget right. So whereas before we would have had lots of different reserves, that we created the budget stabilisation reserve 3 years ago now to create for those underspends. Now there hasn't been any planned use for that reserve up until now, but I know we're going to go on to talk about the report under A7. We've got some significant pressures this year as a result of COVID, and we are intending to bring that underspend back out of reserve to deal with some of those pressures. So although we haven't had to use that reserve in the past, certainly there is a planned use for that to deal with the COVID pressures. What I would say just on reserves generally is we never want to plan to use reserves, so they're always there, kind of those difficult situations or the unforeseen events. So we would almost never set a budget that uses kind of reserves because we try to balance the budget without them. Does that deal with your question around the underspend and the stabilisation reserve?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Martin, could you put a note in the minutes for Emma's question about the Hillsborough Charter?
Yes, will do, Chair.
Thank you.
The charge for public participation that we signed up to, that very few people seem to know we've done. So we just need to know if we're actually who's doing that and if it's our job to oversee it.
Okay. Just make a note as well. Great. Thank you. Next, I'll go in order of the sort of hands that are up on my screen. So I think the next is Charles Williams.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, I want to ask about the movement in the reserves on page, we're really talking about page 49 now, where we actually had a deficit, although be it, as you said, less than budgeted on our services, which is reflected in the second line of total comprehensive income and expenditure. It's a negative, but for some reason, the convention is to show it as a positive at 108 million, and yet the reserves fall, the usable reserves sort of fall by only 3 million. So, I mean, I've struggled to understand the movements in the reserves, and I think it does need a little more explanation in the final version of the accounts.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Karen, what's...
Yeah, I'm just, so obviously just a technical kind of question. So can I just bring in my colleague Lubna to see whether she's able to respond on that question?
Sure. So the movement in the reserve statement is a very technical, driven by accounting statement, and there are quite a few conventions around there. It does include a number of items that feed through. It brings together the comprehensive income and expenditure statement and the balance sheet movement to pick up all movements on the bottom half of the balance sheet. So it's a very technical type statement. It's not necessarily the most informative. Unfortunately, we dictated this format to use. It may be easier to actually look at the movement in earmarked reserves, which are on page 65. That gives more information about what we've actually earmarked in terms of reserve movement. What you have in the movement reserve statement include a lot of technical accounting items, which we're forced to put through our comprehensive income expenditure statement, and then are reversed out in that other comprehensive income expenditure line. So it won't be very meaningful for a decision-making purpose or for actually trying to track any of our usual management accounting transactions. The note on 65 is much more useful for that purpose.
Lubna, thanks for that response. The only thing is, I mean, certainly that there are a few chartered accountants on this committee, and it's very difficult as a chartered accountant to sort of get your head around this. And these accounts, may be read by lay people. I totally agree with Charles that we need some more description in here to help people understand what this really means in effect.
Yes, I thank you very much, Chairman. I mean, I think we're prisoners of the way we have to present the accounts.
Yeah.
It is really important that people, I mean, a reasonably numerate reader will see there's this excess of expenditure over income that then sort of disappears. So it looks as if we're engaged in some rather dodgy accounting. So that's why an explanation is needed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we can look at that as part of the final account.
Yeah, and this is very useful because this is one of the reasons why we asked to get the draft accounts before the meeting. We can look at it in the next meeting. Obviously, we're supposed to do this in June, and then we'd look at it fully in July. But it's a really useful process that we can and sort of look at these accounts really through a sort of layman's eyes and raise these points. Next on my list is Liz.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about this because I'm quite new to all of this, but am I correct in my understanding, because I saw the accounts were dated the 19th of June, but we're not actually going to approve them until September. Is that the case?
That is the case. These are draft accounts.
Draft accounts, so they're going to be dated there. I was just thinking in terms of post-balance sheet events, because things will change in that time frame quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I mean, I suppose on page 5, it refers to a recovery strategy and also about issues around the budget gap over the next 2 years before any ongoing COVID-19 impact. And I just wondered whether or not we wanted to, I mean, the council has done an awful lot about the recovery strategy. We see that in the next paper, whether or not we wanted to bring something into the accounts about that. There's that. And then also in relation to the risks on page 21, I was particularly concerned to see that it said, and would leave the council with insufficient reserves for future use. And, if I was a lay person and I read that, that would just send alarm bells to me. And when I came to look at certain of the notes, and it's quite dense paper to go through, but I thought what we were saying about investment properties valuation on page 81 of the accounts, which seemed to say it was almost all hunky-dory, was inconsistent with what we're saying on page 133 of the pension fund accounts, when we talk about issues around the COVID-19 pandemic causing issues with property valuations, because we've seen that in the funds industry. Funds have been suspended and all sorts of things. So, there just seemed to be some inconsistency there. But those were I think my 4 broad points.
Okay, thank you
very much, Liz. Just hold on, sorry, Tam, before you launch off. Martin, did you get all of that?
Yes, thank you.
You did. Okay, great. Okay, just making sure.
Sorry.
We've started scribbling away notes in the background. Okay, Taryn, over to you.
Okay, so just picking up on your first one around kind of COVID-19 and the recovery planning for going forward. I mean, it's very live, and I think we've got another paper on the agenda as well. So, you know, I think it's a very, very uncertain situation. Although we may be coming out a little bit from the crisis, there is still an awful lot of uncertainty when it comes to our financial position, and in particular, and I'll try not to talk about it in too much detail now, but I'll cover it at the next item. The longer term impact of that. So, you know, the paper that you've got talks about the here and now and the in-year impact. We are very acutely aware, and there's lots of work going on about trying to look at what the longer term impact will be, both financially and non-financially in terms of the council. So, you know, the kind of recovery, the council's recovery is developing kind of as we speak, and I know we will pick it up a bit more in terms of A7 when I know David's going to talk about some of the risks as well around COVID-19. But what we will do is, I think it's very important that before we publish the final accounts, we just take a bit of a stock take on whether we've said enough about COVID-19 in the accounts, whether things are a bit more clearer. I don't know whether there's a bit more kind of future funding around government support, etc. So absolutely, I'll take that on board, and we'll make sure we reconsider it before we publish finally in September. So that's that one. In terms of the risk around kind of the reserves for future years, so actually when you look at our reserve balances on page 60, I did have the page open. When you look at, just bear with me. Yeah, page 65, when you look at our reserve balances, actually, you know, there is potentially 130 million. And what I was suggesting earlier, and Emma's mentioned the conversation that we had, that it might be useful is what the accounts don't demonstrate is the commitments for future years in terms of use of those reserves. They're actually at face value 130 million. Actually, when you look at commitments over the future years, in 3 years' time, those balances will be close to probably 50 million. Now, it's still 50 million. There is a prudent level of reserves that we would always want to maintain. We don't anticipate any planned use of reserves apart from the budget stabilisation for COVID. But that's just a prime example where without any reserves, we would have been in a very tricky situation currently. So, you know, when we say we want to maintain a prudent level, we don't really want to go too level in our kind of reserve. So that's kind of what that risk is. And it's very much for us about creating a budget that's sustainable and it is not reliant on kind of reserves going forward, because they only offer a one-off solution. But we absolutely have to retain them for those unforeseen events that we just don't plan for.
Before you carry on, you know, I think that ties into our last question from Charles. That's very useful information that actually, if you take into account future commitments, you know, that drops to 50 million, which out of the budget that we have for the council is a prudent level. Is there any way we can get that into the notes of the accounts? Because again, you know, from the lay person reading it, they'll be like, well, you're sitting on 136 million and we're all struggling in lockdown here.
I think there definitely needs to be a narrative on this.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, okay. Thank you. We can take that on board. Yep. Did I? Your last point, sorry, Liz, was around the consistency around investment properties and then the pension fund.
Yeah.
Lubna, I must confess, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Lubna, have you got any response to that? Thank you.
Yeah, we do actually, we've recognised that there does need to be some additional wording going into note 4 on page 55, and so we're waiting some information on a technical review about the investment assets for pension fund.
Okay, yeah, just some consistency between the two. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. Just in terms of the pension fund, we haven't had a meeting of the investment committee for a few months, but we did have a meeting, I suppose, 1 month into lockdown, and we were still in reasonably good shape. So just only because I'm not sure when the next investment committee is. I think it's in September as well, but we're not expecting any dramatic revaluation of that. Next on the list is David Lindsay.
I want to go back to page 49. Can you just clarify at the top of the page, general fund, it's in thousands. So we're saying the general fund balance is 145 million, are we? And the total reserves that we've got, if I'm understanding it rightly, 1.5 billion. Is that correct?
Okay. Yeah.
Can I say it is correct, but it's the usable reserves, a figure of 287,890, which is available. The rest of them all statutory accounts, which we can't call upon.
Yeah.
So we are. My point. I just want to make sure that we were talking the right order of magnitude.
Yeah, so Councillor Lindsay, so I think third column in from the right hand side, the 287 is what we would call usable. The 1.2 billion is essentially unusable. So they're kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, Lubna, they're kind of more statutory adjustments and accounting adjustments. And
so under what conditions would those ever be able to be used?
So they actually don't hold cash. They're not backed by cash or held in any usable manner. They are literally accounting entries that we are required to put through the accounts in order to comply with various international financial reporting standards. So they literally reversals of items to take us back to what can be charged against the general fund balance. So they're accounting adjustments and don't represent cash at all.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Taryn, page 65, and I know that we've looked at it before, but I seem to recall discussing with you a while ago, looking at reserves in general. And my questions of these earmarked reserves are: how do we compare? How do now we compare with other local authorities? And how do we compare with where you, a couple of years ago, wanted to be projecting forward to 2020 as we are now?
Okay, so in terms of how we compare with others, so this is probably a typical answer that you'd expect from me. I think there are some authorities where we're going to be in a similar sort of kind of magnitude. However, there will be other authorities that have significantly less reserves than what we do. And, certainly this is coming to light at the moment in response to COVID, where we know there straight away there's a handful of authorities that are really struggling to be able to balance the books through COVID. So what I haven't got and what might be useful for this group as additional information is exactly how we do compare to others. So I know certainly there's some analysis that's done by London councils. I just haven't got it to my fingertips. I know I've got it. So I think that's probably an additional piece of information that I'll circulate around you. In terms of where did we want to be? So I would say, asking me at this point in time, on the assumption that we don't have, we wouldn't, like I said at the beginning, we would never plan to use reserves. So if we can successfully come through COVID without any significant use of reserves, and we'll come on to that under A7 paper, then we are not a million miles from where we thought we would be, and certainly some of the commitments that are earmarked over the next few years. So if you take Grenfell, for example, actually we are committing to use that over the next couple of years because it's going to be funding our 50 million. But equally, something around the special projects, we know that we have got significant challenges coming forward over the next few years. So even before COVID, we were dealing with a budget gap of 25 million. I personally think it may be more now. So we've got some other non-COVID pressures that are coming through. We absolutely have to be planning for the future, and some of that will require some investment. So I am anticipating some use of special projects reserve, use of the car parking to fund capital programme. But actually, a lot of that we'd kind of anticipated. So when I talk about the planned use taking us down to about 50 million, that's kind of what we anticipated pre-COVID. So I would say, David, and I may come back in September and maybe saying something very different because we're in such uncertain times. But in terms of reserves, I'm not really concerned that we're not where we thought we were going to be.
No, but can we just change one of the key words, one of the key verbs that you've been using? It's not so much where you thought you would be, but I remember discussing with you when I had the job as lead member, how you hoped, I emphasize, how you hoped that we would be able to tidy up the reserves in terms of going from very many, which is what we had before, to rather fewer and more meaningful and more accessible. And I think that's the progress that I wanted to discuss, where you feel that we are at now. And that's, I accept it's qualitative rather than quantitative, but if you could just give a gut feel for that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so sorry. So yeah, absolutely. So 3 years ago, we would have had very, very many more reserves than what we've got here. So following the fire at Grenfell Tower, we did review our reserves and we did streamline them. I think that's right. So we've adopted a much more corporate approach to our reserves. So rather than individual services having own reserves, actually how we manage our reserves is kind of led corporately, which I believe is right. So Micah's section 151 isn't here, but he almost holds overall responsibility. So in that respect, absolutely, that review is put the number of reserves and the nature of the reserves where we want to be. Some of those are ring fenced. Some of those actually we can't access, but of the ones that we can, they're actually just a handful. Which is very different to where we were a few years ago.
No, thank you for that.
Thanks, Taryn. Next up, we have Andrew.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Some general observations. This is a very comprehensive report, and we're governed by its content. Its content is largely governed by regulation. Picking up, though, your point on what the layperson would get from this, I'm not quite a layperson, but when I come to Mike Curtis's Chief Financial Officer's narrative report, it's all very soothing. It obviously acknowledges what's gone on in the world, but I just think that there's been some big financial impacts on the council. And I don't get a sense of why those big financial impacts don't cause more ripple. So Grenfell, we've gone over a number of times in the past, but that's very specific to the council, huge financial impact of it. We're in COVID, there's huge financial impact overlaying on sort of general stretch in local authority finances. I just wonder if somebody who's looking at these accounts to just understand sort of how the council has sort of come through these impacts doesn't get a real sense of either the reserves that we've talked about that have been there and have been used, what reserves there are still left, and a little bit more of being on a bit more anxious about things. There are these words, you read them carefully and they're quite impactful, but they're quite soothingly put together as well. So just an impression that I can't remember who was speaking, that at the final stages of review of this document, someone will take stock to see if it gives if it's tonally right.
Yeah, and so many thanks for the feedback. And I think kind of the last part of maybe the narrative statement, the outlook, starts to pick up on some of that. But I'm sensing that maybe we just need to revisit that. We're in for, I think I said in my opening introduction, we're in for a tricky couple of years, I think, both in the current year with COVID, but also longer term as well for generally local authority funding. So I will take that away as a comment, and maybe it's the outlook section that we just need to expand a little, but maybe also bring a bit to the forefront as well in terms of Mike's introduction right at the beginning of that section as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Emma.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Thank you, Chair. I just wondered, I can't find it now, but I think we've got a cash reserve of 60 million. I think I found that in here somewhere. Heaven knows where. What's that? What is the purpose of that, and when do we use it? What can we use it for?
Lubna, do you know, did you quote 16 million? Sorry, Emma.
60, I think it's 60 I found somewhere.
You see that in the Treasury report?
Yeah, it would be page 90. That's the total cash and cash equivalents. So that's actually cash in the bank and some very short-term deposits that are liquid. So that's actually our bank balance.
Okay, what do we use that for though? When can we use that? Quite a lot of money.
It's actually physically cash, so it's all our payments that are going out, or the income that we're receiving. So that fluctuates depending on what the position is any point during the year. But that is just literally the cash that we hold within our bank accounts.
So it's not ours.
Well, it is ours. It's used for all of
some of it we have to pass through. For example, business rates. Presumably, we have to pass that through to the central government if we were collecting business rates, etc. Is that correct, Lubna?
So yeah, to some extent, yes. It would also be all of the amounts we hold to meet our obligations for paying all our creditors and paying staff and so on.
Okay.
Working.
I think so. I think I've got that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Great. I think that's all. No, Cosette. Sorry. Question from Cosette. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My point is related to similar points already made about the tone that's expressed at the beginning and further on page 24 with regard to the outlook. So I won't repeat the sentiments already expressed, but I did want to add one thing, which is when we're thinking about the outlook, perhaps there are other things to mention in addition to COVID-19. For example, when you look at the pages running up to that outlook, when we're talking about risks, I would have expected to see some mention of some of those risks also impacting this outlook above and beyond the obvious and explicit impact of COVID-19.
Okay, so we can certainly take that on board. So it feels like some of the narrative is all there, but it's kind of maybe not coming together and having the kind of impact of, I think, urgency and kind of pace that I think it's been described as. So we can go back and revisit that as part of the final accounts. But thank you, really helpful.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Taryn and Lubna, for dealing with those. Yeah, quite a bit to report back to Mike and the rest of the team, and we'll have another look at it in September.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Next up, agenda A6, addendum to the audit plan. Paul and Ellen, I assume we've got Ellen on the line as well.
We do. We're both here.
Great. Okay, over to you.
Hi there. Thank you. So this, you may recall at the previous meeting we shared. Oh, my camera's gone. We shared the plan, and this set out in detail the risks across the council audit and the pension fund. The committee was in February, which was just before the world changed and COVID-19 then impacted on a lot of plans, including how we'll actually undertake the audit, as well as clearly some of the management judgments within the audit and the impact on some figures which would be in place as at the balance sheet year end. And closely related to some of your previous conversation, the change in impact on the going concern of the council, which is also something we need to consider from an audit perspective for the 12 months to come from the date of the opinion as well. So what we've done in this addendum, we have, rather than update all of the various parts of the plan for all of the various parts of the accounts where those considerations would have an impact, we've shared with you one single significant risk related to the coronavirus, which encapsulates all of the key significant parts of the work that we're doing where the coronavirus would add a particular additional impact. One of those is clearly in terms of some of the governance changes in place at the council and some of the changes in processes to be able to compile and deliver the accounts remotely, and obviously our ability to then audit them remotely. And certainly from our experience of having finished all of the NHS audits where we audited those 100% remotely, we were able to what was very evident was that we were able to deliver the audit remotely without in any way undermining the quality or the standards or the level of assurance that would otherwise be expected in a normal year. That was very important because our regulator made it, I think, at the time of the very first cough or wheeze back in March, the first thing the regulator communicated to us and to all firms was that under no circumstances was the pandemic to be enabling in any way any form of reduction in terms of the assurance behind an audit opinion. And our experience in the NHS shows that is deliverable. The other parts then of that significant risk focus on your biggest balances in the accounts and the impact that the pandemic has at them as at the 31st of March. And they are quite simply the usual suspects. One is clearly the impact on asset values for your property, land and buildings as at the 31st of March. That was squarely within lockdown. It was at a time when the market had ground to a halt. Your valuer has, and in fact all valuers are working under the basis of a material valuation uncertainty as at the year end. What that means is, because of the unusual circumstances, it's unlikely or there's a possibility that the values may be materially different, but there'll be no way of knowing if they are or not because it is such an unusual circumstance. And our work, of course, will be taking that into account as well in terms of your values, and also then disclosing that in our opinion alongside your the disclosures in the financial statements. That's not a qualification or modification of the opinion in that sense. That is simply just emphasising the unique nature of this particular year-end date compared to a normal year. Other factors which are relevant include similarly the impact on the assets within the pension fund. Clearly, again, as at 31st of March, because of that particular date in question, there's a greater uncertainty that would apply to those, and work that we're doing to undertake to see what the impact may be. And clearly the valuers have done too, or the actuaries have done too. And as I mentioned, the longer term financial plans, we've had various discussions with Mike in terms of what the impact is on the council, the sorts of funding that's coming in, what that's likely to mean in terms of the council's going concern status. And again, that is also information we'll be taking into account as we deliver our audit. I get linked with some of the earlier conversation that you had, I think, and without, I wouldn't want to sort of prejudge what our findings are going to be. You were talking about how you compare with other councils, and that is work we'll be looking at as well. This isn't a council where I'm wondering whether or not any statutory directions are needed in terms of there being a going concern issue because of the history that you've got and the level of reserves compared to others. You're not one of those councils in the sort of worry list in that sense. Notwithstanding that, though, clearly the financial challenges on all councils is significant because of the unusual circumstances that we're in. So the addendum essentially summarises the additional risk that arises from the coronavirus, both in the production and in the numbers within the financial statements, the work we'll do in response, and otherwise we share it with you so that you see that. But our main report in terms of how the audit has gone will be at the September meeting. Very quick word in terms of timescales, as I think Taryn said, we've started the audit with the council. The statutory deadlines have been extended until the end of November. We don't anticipate needing anywhere near that date in terms of doing the work. It does take slightly longer doing it all remotely because there is a lot of back and forth, and you can't walk around the corner and have a quick chat with someone and sort something out in 10 minutes. You have to set up a call, you need to send data back and forth, etc. So it takes slightly longer, but we're still anticipating a September finish in terms of the work that we're doing. And on the basis of what we've seen so far, there's nothing that suggests that's going to be materially thwarted. So I'll happily take any questions, and indeed happy to go into any detail if necessary on any of the risk that I've just summed up, or indeed the wider audit in progress to date.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we're all brimming with confidence seeing the home office of a proper accountant with stacks of paperwork behind you. Right, let's see what we've got. We've got a question first from Liz.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Paul. I mean, I fully appreciate, these are really difficult times, and you've talked about getting sufficient audit evidence. But I just wondered, and you say that the audit is progressing, but are there issues around actually getting sort of physical evidence, sort of going back to sort of prime documentation and verifying assets and those sorts of procedures?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Because and not least because it links this year with increased requirements from the FRC in terms of what's required for that sort of thing. The technology is a huge enabler in that respect. So whereas previously, and I'll give an example, if we The council's bank statements, the council would normally download those into a spreadsheet and then give the spreadsheet to us, and we can use that spreadsheet and do our own testing from it. In a normal year, we would stand behind someone as they access the bank account. We would see that you are live in your bank account. We would know that those are the actual figures being translated. We would watch every step. What we're able to do this year, because we have the Teams facility and because we have both a share screen facility and a video conferencing facility, we're able to make the same observations online over the video cameras. Council officers then, we watch them take screen grabs of what they're doing, and we watch them email them to us through the online technology, and then that evidence therefore stands in our file as evidence that we've seen. We've been able to observe right back to the prime documentation, in this case for the bank statements, but it also works for other evidence as well. It takes slightly longer, as you might imagine, than just standing there watching somebody run reports and then sort of handing them to us. But it is doable. So in that respect, we've not yet come across any particular part of the audit where we've not been able to get that direct observation evidence over the prime evidence that we're seeking to use. The only one which would have been an issue, and it doesn't apply here, would have been for stock takes, because we physically couldn't be there. But in Kensington's case, the value of stock on the balance sheet is not material, and so and the likelihood of it being materially misstated is also very low. So that doesn't present a barrier to us in our ability to be satisfied that even if we haven't observed any stock takes, which we wouldn't normally do because of its size here, it wouldn't materially impact the work that we do or your financial statements.
Okay, thank you. If it's taking longer, is your fee likely to rise?
So we're not working on the basis of that at the moment, and again, without prejudging it, it's taking longer, but also there's sort of mitigations we can put in place as well. We're looking to try and absorb as much as we can. The fee that we put in the plan at the moment, we're not anticipating that fee being any different at the end point. I think it would be more likely if for example, it turned out there were some errors in the accounts that were unanticipated, that however they got in there, that would be more likely to change to increase the fee than simply it taking longer for observations. The biggest risk, I think, in terms of the fee is some of the challenges getting information from the third-party supplier in Hampshire, rather than the direct audit process, because that sometimes needs specialist IT support to come in and support it, which is a separate charge rather than the actual audit process itself.
Okay, thank you.
I was on mute. Next up, questions is David.
Paul, this is a general question, but I just wonder whether you can confirm. If you have post-balance sheet events, and you probably expect them to last for, be able to see with a degree of certainty for 6 months, and we've now had lockdown for 4 and a bit months, and it's not going to ease up completely for another couple of months. Is there going to be a single entity within the country that will not have the, I don't want to call it the qualification, but the sense that you described of the effects of COVID? So that every single entity, whether a court, whether a company, whether part of government or whatever else, will have some, will have been affected in their audit by COVID and lockdown. Is that a fair comment?
No, I think that is a very fair comment. I can't think of an entity that wouldn't be affected, to be honest, unless it was either very small or simply an entity that had very few investments and very few assets on its balance sheet and very few liabilities in that sense. So I think from a post-balance sheet event perspective, technically the lockdown isn't a post-balance sheet event because it started before the year end, but there are many features of the lockdown, whether that's the collectability of debtors, the collectability of council tax, or the reductions in the collection rates, or whether that is sharp falls or movements in terms of assets or pension liabilities, which could happen as a result, or may yet still happen before we get to the signing of the opinion, all of which will be eligible for potential disclosure should they happen. Taking the asset point in particular, other than where a company or an organisation or an entity doesn't really have any assets. Where they do, all valuers are working on the basis of the valuation uncertainty, and on that basis, pretty much all accounts in every sector, and certainly the ones we're seeing as a firm, have got those same issues that are now a feature of the audit. And in fact, going concern is a significantly increased risk for almost every sector, including local government, but even more so for non-public sector bodies.
No, absolutely get that. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, David. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Paul, I don't know if you said it, and I didn't listen, but my question is that the material uncertainty in the property valuers report, how are you going to deal with that in your audit report?
Yeah, so we will do the work we would normally do. So the valuer has provided figures, and those figures are, management has obviously considered those figures, applied their own judgments, and they appear in the accounts. We'll do all the work that we normally would do. So I think we'll get to a position which is probably the same position as the valuer is in, which is other than the things you just cannot quantify, the figures are materially okay. What we will then do is the disclosure that the valuers, or the declaration the valuers made over that material uncertainty, will feature in your own accounts, and will disclose that uncertainty, because there's very little more you can do. I don't think any valuer would be able to, because part of the problem is the market just ground to a halt.
Yeah, Paul, are you going to make any special reference to that in your audit report?
Exactly. So that disclosure will be in the accounts, and we would emphasise that particular disclosure within our audit report as well. So it wouldn't be a qualification, but it would be.
All right, that's the right straight. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Cosette, is your hands up?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry.
Just building on a related question from earlier, to which, Paul, you responded that you thought things were going well overall, and heading into September, you were anticipating things would carry on going well. If anything were to occur that might jeopardize the timeline, at what point will you make that call and send up the warning signal, so to speak?
So we would constantly monitor it. To be honest, we share with the council on a very regular basis sort of a comms log, so a list of what we've asked for, when we got it, if not, when will it come. That's what we would then use if we were coming into mid-September. Certainly, if we're coming into mid-September and we still had items on that which were red weighted because they were we hadn't had them, or similarly, some of we were finding an unusually unexpected number of amendments and changes in the accounts, which was therefore causing things to take longer. When we get to September, that's when we'd start to have the conversation with management in the first instance that said, do you know what, this is looking at risk. So yeah, early September, I think, would be when we would make that call if it was looking significant.
Thank you.
Great, that's it for questions. Thank you very much, Paul, and Ellen, no doubt, in the background. And we will see you in September.
You will.
Face to face. And yeah, please let us know anything before then, so we can feed through to the committee.
We will. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're moving on to, just get this right, A7, which is risk management update, specifically requested on COVID-19. And I think David is going to be doing that. Are you, David, please?
Thank you, Chair, with Taryn Eves as well. So normally we'd be presenting a strategic risk register to the committee at this meeting, but obviously you've all been reflecting already on the impact of COVID-19, not just on the council and the borough, but across the country since we last met in February. So following discussion with you, what we're doing is presenting a report which looks at both the financial impact so far of COVID-19 on the council, and I also want to just summarise for you the work the council has been doing to manage risk during lockdown, as well as looking how the ongoing recovery will shape the risks facing the council over the coming months. So the first part of the report, which starts on page 162, relates to the financial impacts. I'll ask Taryn to pick up on that, then I'll come back in on the risk management aspects.
Right, thank you, David. So yeah, so I'll just talk you through some headlines because hopefully a lot of the detail is in the report. Just to kind of bring in some of the background, some of the context. So very early on, actually, as we started to even just go into lockdown at very early stages, we were very keen that we had quite a robust financial monitoring process in for the impact of COVID. We're absolutely acknowledging so much uncertainty, but I think that was certainly something that we wanted to put in place. So even before we started to kind of reporting to any committees, we did have that process in place right from the start. What I would say, and I think we'll probably talk about uncertainty quite a lot through this paper, there is absolutely uncertainty going forward. So with all of our kind of projections for at least the current year, they are based on some assumptions. So we're using our best knowledge about what we think will happen, both in the immediate term, so the first 3 months of the lockdown, but also some of the kind of longer term impact as well. So just some of the headlines. So didn't think I'd ever be sitting here saying this. I don't think so. We are great. Before any kind of support, we are currently looking at an overspend of about 42.4 million in the current year. So 2020, 2021. Like I say, I don't think any of us ever wanted to be sitting here saying that, but I think we have to be open and honest about the scale of the challenge. What I would say is that figure is constantly under review. So even in between kind of publishing the report for Audit Committee, we are already working on the next month's figures. So that's constantly being revised. So maybe as part of this committee, you might want to receive some regular updates over the course of the year, because I would like to say that that's a final figure, but I suspect it isn't. It is going to change. So the report shows a bit of a breakdown of that. So it's made up of 13.6 million of spending pressures, as outlined in the report. So some of that is around the pressures around adult social care. Some of that is new services that we've set up. So we've created a hub, we put in some hardship support. All of that kind of is classed as spending pressures. What is more significant for Kensington, and I'm not saying we're unique in that sense, there are other boroughs out there, but actually is the income loss. So we know very much that we rely on our income sources, and a large proportion of those will be impacted from COVID. So you'll see within the table that we're estimating at the moment about 28.3 million pressure around income. That's broadly made up of, well, it's made up of lots of different areas, but the kind of the top three are car parking income. It's the kind of top one. We're not seeing the visitors come into the borough. Secondly is around commercial portfolios. So there has been there will be a non-collection on our commercial portfolio rent. And the third is around some of our cultural facilities as well. So those three areas are what I would say that almost make up the bulk of the 28.3 million. So we're starting off with a figure of 42.4. We have received some government support through the year. So very first tranches of government support came out in April and May. We obviously got notification last week of further support so the original support was about 10 million. We got a further support of 1.7 million last year. There is still one form of government support yet that we haven't yet had the final details, but we've made some good indications of where we think we'll be. So what government are saying, which is really important for us, is that for our income losses, they are willing to support around 75% of those losses. So kind of coming back to my point about income being a real pressure, that's really important for us. We think that's potentially worth about 10 million of government support. So it is really quite significant. So once you've taken into account all of that, it still does leave just over 20 million overspend for the current year. I think when we mentioned, I think Emma, you asked a question under the accounts of the underspend. We are proposing to bring out the 11.3 million underspend that we put into reserve at close down. We are planning on bringing that back out to deal with some of those pressures. And we've also got a corporate contingency that we will use for unforeseen events. So there is some mitigation, there is some combination of government support and some funding that we can use, but it does still probably leave an overspend, we think, based on our best knowledge at this time, of around 4 million. So like I say, that's changing all the time. That could go up, that could go down, and obviously we'll keep the committee updated. The kind of latter part of my section before I pass over to David is we are now doing lots of work with services to look at potential for in-year savings. Now, the likelihood of some of that will be some efficiencies that we might be able to find in year. The likelihood of probably finding significant in-year savings, I think, is fairly minimal. So we will continue to do that, because actually, if we can avoid the use of reserves, that's got to be a better position to be in. So I think just one more note before I pass over is, so that's the current year. There is a lot of work that's going on as part of our financial planning at this point in time, looking at particularly some of those income sources, whether one, will they recover for next year, or actually two, there could be potentially some income sources that never recover. So we're trying to use some of our best intelligence and insight, and I say best because actually we just don't know the full story, to try and do some kind of looking at what that longer term impact will be, because I do believe that there will be some. However, before COVID, we were already dealing with a budget pressure of about 25 million over the next 2 years. So although services are looking at some in-year savings to try and deal with that overspend in the current year, we are absolutely, it's this time of the year when we're kind of forward looking to next year about how we might deal with some of those pressures next year. At the end of the day, the statutory requirements set by balanced budget is still there. So we absolutely have to do all of that work. So it's a very, very intense week, very intense 6 to 8 weeks for both the finance team and services, trying to get both an idea about what the current year might look like, but also we're very much in the depths of planning for the next year. And I think what I've also done is, and I think it picks up on some of the points that were picked up on the narrative, is I've highlighted just a couple of the other financial risks within the paper. So COVID is absolutely really, really critical at the moment, but I just wanted to flag to the committee there are other financial risks as well. The most significant one, and I know if Mike was here, I think we've probably been talking about this for probably 2 years now, is the impact of the fair funding formula. So it has been delayed, but we do know it's coming. We've got the spending review coming in the autumn. We just don't know what that might look like for local government going forward. But what's more significant is if government pursue their plans to change the funding formula, which indications are that they will, it's just that it's been delayed and we haven't yet. We're just in the process of trying to get an idea of what that impact might be. So that's not COVID related at all. So I suppose I just wanted to get across to the committee that I think COVID is very important, but we mustn't lose sight that there are other financial risks as well that we're tracking. So that's all I was going to say. David, over to you for
if I may just jump in briefly before David starts. First of all, Taryn, that was excellent, and I really think some of your straight talking needs to go into Mike's report for the accounts, because you gave it to us, gave us the facts, and gave it straight. The other point I'd like to make is, we have these reserves. If we're ever going to use some of our reserves, surely now is the time to use them. I don't think the council would get any criticism for using reserves in this year. I mean, this is what we have reserves for. So I agree on balancing the books and everything and trying our best, but I mean, this is an unprecedented situation. I mean, who knows whether we're going to have another one next year, but God willing, we won't. And now's the time maybe we should be considering using some of our reserves.
Yeah, so absolutely. So, and I think before we certainly found out about the most recent tranche of government funding, which for ours is worth almost 12 million, actually we were, so if you'd asked me 6 weeks ago around our financial position in the current year, I probably would have been saying I would have been saying something very different to what I'm saying today. So actually to use reserves, we would have been talking about kind of 15 million. That's a very, very different use of reserves compared to, there is some, I think there is some potential for in-year savings. The challenge that we've got is that we absolutely need people to be focusing on next year as well. So, when a lot of services are still dealing with a bit of a crisis, it is still a public health kind of pandemic. So particularly in the world of adults, they're still dealing with those day-to-day challenges. So I can't say that we won't use reserves in the current year. What we do say, however, is why wouldn't we try, if there's some savings there, some efficiencies that are there anyway, why would we not use those before we kind of turn to reserves? Because we just don't know what next year is going to look like, and we don't plan to use reserves next year, but we almost probably can't rule it out completely.
Yeah, I mean, my only comment on that is we have been talking about efficiencies and in-year savings really for the last couple of years. Yeah. So, how much can you squeeze it? It's not as if, we've got a sort of a lot of excess expenditure in the council anyway. We have made savings and efficiencies, everything like that already. And I don't, I'm speaking personally rather than for the committee. But I don't think using reserves during this year would open you up to criticism.
Okay, thanks.
Right, questions. So I think, David, if it's all right, we'll just do questions on this bit, and then you can go as afterwards. Emma, you're up first.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to add to our list of woes, actually. Sorry, but the things that I'm concerned about are long-term business failure, and a lot of businesses clinging on by their fingernails. And if this goes on, which I fear it may, and if we have another spike in the autumn, which I fear we may, then they're not going to, they won't last, even if they've been hanging on over the summer. So that's one thing, and that is not only bad for us, but that's generally for income for the council and so on. That's not looking good. Also, people and staff, of course, and our people out there who may have survived COVID. I don't know how many of our staff have survived it. I certainly know people who haven't. But some people are going to be ill long term. This is a long term thing. It's like a hideous. I know people who've been treating COVID, quite a few. The doctors and nurses in my family. Some people aren't going to recover, and they're going to be working at a slower rate. People who are, working, whether they're staff or business people or our residents out there, some people may need long-term help. And so I don't know, we can't account for that, but it's something on our worry list, I think. And of course, the whole issue of food insecurity is awful, really awful. I get reports back from our food banks all the time. There are people who are so embarrassed at being poor for the first time in their lives that they're not asking, or when they come in, they're absolutely devastated, and they've been starving themselves because they're too embarrassed. The health inequalities are already pretty ropey, especially obviously in the north, that were existing already. We're going to have a lot of people really, really struggling, malnourished and so on. And that's going to be long term, and we have to think about that somehow. We can't just expect people to get back to work and be okay, because, as I say, a lot of people are already malnourished and they're going to need extra help. So that's there's going to be no bouncing back. And I 100% support the chair on using reserves. I've been fighting this battle for years and years. We know it has rained before. It's raining now. They were saved for a rainy day. It is raining. As for any so-called efficiencies, you know what? I think the low-hanging fruit has all been picked already over the last few years. I'm really worried. We have to look after people. Some people aren't going to survive. Suicide rate has gone up already. We don't want people to lose hope, and the council has got to hang on and get people through this. It really has. That's my plea, along with a list of yet more worries. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So it's a plea rather than a question.
Well, I was agreeing with you, Chair, about the reserves, but I just want to add on to our list of worries. Sorry.
Yes, we're both in agreement there.
Yeah, Chair, can I just come back on just the support to businesses and the kind of long-term impact, because I know certainly kind of for David and I, well, we've both been very close to the support to businesses, and we're absolutely, we are concerned about, certainly in October when the furlough scheme ends, kind of what does that look like for businesses, but also actually I'm quite heavily involved in the financial hardship for individuals side of things. So I chair one of the groups, and absolutely we know that is not a short-term issue. Absolutely, this is going to continue into the longer term and kind of future years. And we're starting to look at what does that longer-term support need to look like. We're very, very acutely aware. So we have all services around the table, very acutely aware that our concern is maybe we haven't seen the peak. And actually, we think there is more and more people perhaps coming and requiring council support. So, the private rented sector is a big concern for us. Some of those jobs that people are in when the furlough scheme ends won't be there. So it's very, very much on our radar. It's very, very difficult to predict the impact. But what I would say is that certainly I'm involved in some of those discussions, so I do know that they are going on. And like I say, David and I have provided an awful support to businesses around the grants and the kind of the business rates over the last kind of 3 months. So we are very, very aware that it's a really tough time for businesses, and we as a council we will do what we can, but I think it's the longer term impact that we can't lose sight of.
Okay, thank you. That's very reassuring. Thank you.
Next up on the question list is Charles.
So unmute. Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, on the subject of reserves, I think, as Emma's just said, I mean, there are a lot of sort of uncertainties and things can get very difficult. Therefore, I think in the current year and planning next year, we should try to avoid digging on most reserves too much. The one exception I would make is the car parking reserve, which we have always struggled to make use of, and given the decline in income there, which hopefully will not be permanent, it is clearly justified in drawing on that reserve.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you, noted.
Cosette?
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to pick up on the comments that were made about two things. Firstly, that we may not yet have reached the peak of hardship in the aftermath or even in the middle of the situation we're in with COVID-19. But above and beyond that, there are also financial pressures that had nothing to do with COVID-19 and pre-existed before the pandemic hit us hardly. So my question is this. When we're talking about the balancing of using the reserves because it's raining, yet anticipating there may be long-term impacts that we also need to be mindful of with regard to our reserves, to what extent is scenario analysis being employed for assessing the income at risk, the probability of that risk in some kind of low, medium, high state, and also looking at that out over time for the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, to look at the various ways in which these hardships may hit that we may need to plan for?
Yeah, so no, thank you for that. So in the current year, so what we are doing is, so the 42.4 million that I said quite easily, actually, what that comes from is a line by line, every single budget in the council, line by line, looking at what the impact was in the first 3 months, and then some scenario planning about what coming out of lockdown really means. And that will vary. It will vary from budget line to budget line. So we have got almost 3 different scenarios for every budget line. That's based on what we think is going to happen. But like I say, there's an awful lot of assumptions. And interestingly, we're starting to see the latest information, and actually maybe we were a little bit pessimistic on parking income, and that's the more we get into the year, the more we can look at our actual data to be able to do some of that forecasting. So it is scenario planning. I can't say we know exactly, but we are absolutely almost doing a high, medium and low type scenario, so we know the scale, almost the range of what the impact would be. So in terms of then future years, so the work that's going on at the moment is looking at the impact, like I said, on future years of some of those income streams. So at the moment, this 25 million gap assumes that all of our income returns to normal next year. There is a bit of a concern, and through the work that we're doing at the moment, looking at what are those income streams that might not quite recover next year, or they might not recover until later on into the summer of next year. So I don't know, take our tour, some of the income from our tourist kind of industry that may not pick up in the first part of the year, but we may see a different picture in the summer. So, all of that work is going on at the moment. Like I say, we haven't got it resolved, we haven't got it solved, but actually I feel like we're having the right conversations to be able to get some good indications of what the problems might be. And therefore, reserves do offer a solution, but what they don't offer is that long-term solution. So what we need to do, we need to be in a position where we're building a sustainable budget for the future. And you know, there probably isn't an awful lot of long-hanging fruit, but that's where I know David's going to come on to talk about some of the recovery work. Actually, that's where we think much longer term. So those conversations are probably likely to start in the autumn. It's just quite early to, it's so hard to think about the future when you're still dealing with the crisis at the moment. So, yeah.
And just a follow-up question, who are you turning to for broader engagement on just constructive challenge on the assumptions that you're making in assessing the risks to income and planning? Yeah, so well, a couple of routes that we take. So one is that we've had Empower working with us on our kind of wider transformation piece for a little while. So they certainly do challenge us, but they also bring expertise from other boroughs as well. So it's really helpful to kind of feed in, look what others are doing. I'm also part of a Deputies 151 group across London, and we've got established groups that talk about these and have these conversations. So, you know, every borough is slightly different, but actually sharing some of that expertise. I suppose the one thing is we're all going through it together, and therefore let's talk about some of those kind of what some of those challenges are that we're being faced. So what's really interesting is we do a monthly return. We have to do a monthly return to MHCLG, and we see how we compare to the rest of London. And every borough makes different assumptions, but you do start to test each other on what assumptions you're making so that you're not completely an outlier. So it comes both formally and informally. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next on the list is David.
Tara, briefly, how much have you shared this thinking and what you've written here with other local authorities, and how different are we, if at all?
Yeah, so it probably picks up on the update I just gave. So I certainly share it through my network. I know that Mike will share it through his London network as well. So we are sharing it informally. We're also sharing it formally with MHCLG as well. So they will quite often kind of challenge on some of our assumptions, and we had a call with them this week. But certainly from a London perspective, there is ongoing conversations about what are people assuming, what are some of the pressures. I think the kind of income and expenditure split that I talked about, I wouldn't say, like I said, we're not unique. So, you know, Westminster in particular, Camden, we're also experiencing some of those where the pressure from income is harder than the pressure from expenditure. So I'm not saying our expenditure pressures aren't there. It just for us, it's very much more around our income, and predominantly that parking income. So we do talk very closely with the likes of Westminster and Camden who have similar income streams as what we do.
Thank you. Andrew, question?
David, thank you very much. I'm going to have to learn the technique of pressing my hand up button.
All right.
Get in earlier. It's interesting. It's like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Pressing the button quick, you know. Anyway, just a couple of things. I wanted to support your view of use of reserves. Secondly, I think that I'd like to see the range of scenarios, and there's one I particularly like to see, which would be the doomsday scenario, sort of the worst case, really, because longer term effects could actually hurt Kensington and Chelsea far more than bucolic Kent, where I'm living. So I think that it would just be interesting to sort of push the assumptions towards the pessimistic end, and I'd be interested to see that, please, as further work goes on this. And then lastly, just to say, Chair, I'm just going to have to leave the meeting at this point, but I want to say you've chaired this virtual meeting very well. In fact, it's in some ways more enjoyable than actually being in council offices, but I find there's quite a lot of them at Zoom type or these types of meetings that I attend. But anyway, well done. So
thank you very much. I'll take a virtual now.
Colleagues as well. I'll sign off now.
Great. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. So that's all the questions. I just wanted, before David starts, I just wanted to say, Taryn, you really have been superb tonight. We're very lucky to have you. You've answered our questions extremely well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, you're up.
Thank you, Taryn, and thank you, Chair. So briefly, section 4 of the report, starting on page 166, sets out how we've been managing risk during the lockdown. So we've been very much invoking the emergency planning arrangements from mid-March. And what we've been doing is actually maintaining a COVID-19 risk register throughout the period that's been reviewed on a weekly basis at the gold and silver meetings, looking at how we share information again with colleagues across London. So London Resilience Forum has been very much coordinating the kind of key risks that authorities are facing through the pandemic. And the COVID risk register, which we've set out in Appendix 1 on page 172, is the latest iteration of the risk register about a week and a half ago. And it's quite different to the strategic register in a couple of regards. The main one being it's very much focused on...
Can I just stop you briefly there? You're
using
numbers that I haven't got.
Oh, sorry. This is in the pack. Sorry, apologies, Ian. Sorry. So page 5 in the report is where the section starts. Sorry, and page 11 is where the appendix is. Apologies for that. So this is very much the risk register for COVID-19, which is being reviewed weekly. Very much focused on the short-term and immediate risks that are being faced through COVID-19, and very much reflects a number of the issues that Councillor Dent Code was talking about earlier, which is very right in terms of kind of impact in terms of food sustainability and food availability, in terms of the impact on residents, in terms of employment, in terms of business. And this is something the council is very closely working on, has been working on already. In section 4.3, we've set out how we're managing some of the specific risks. That includes also how we've set up some new services from scratch in virtually days. So the Shielding Hub, which is now has been engaging with over 6,000 vulnerable residents, was set up within the space of a week. It involved contacting all vulnerable residents to make sure they're okay, to see what their needs were, including delivering food parcels and with our VCS partners. And more recently, the government has ensured that local authorities have a key role to play in the National Test and Trace strategy and local outbreak control plans. So again, making sure that we're able to use the new enforcement powers that came about last week that government announced, particularly in terms of closures in the event of a local outbreak. Again, in 4.33, we've been very clear about the health and safety of residents, staff and contractors being paramount. So there's a robust series of risk assessments, both for services, for buildings and for individuals that are in place. We've had a robust sort of process for managing the supply of PPE and making sure it's directed into the right places where it's needed. And obviously we're looking at and risk assessing how we ease lockdown to be able to reintroduce face-to-face services so that it's done in a safe way for both staff and residents. And I'll just briefly touch on section 4.4, which sort of summarises the approach for the coming months, which the Chief Executive set out in his paper to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 8th of July. So there are very much 4 concurrent sets of challenges we've been working on. There's the response, the immediate response. There's lifting lockdown in terms of the government announcements and making sure we're COVID secure in our buildings and the services we provide. Then there's the transitioning period. Obviously, as people are saying, there's a potential for a sort of second wave or for local outbreaks to occur. But through that period of transition, we also will be learning from lockdown about how we can deliver services differently and how we can deliver them in a better way, and potentially also have some potential for generating savings. And then the recovery phase, which, as Taryn alluded to, is very much the research phase we're in now, but starts in the autumn, is looking at the longer term impacts on business, on residents, on the community, making sure that we've got the right arrangements, the right policies in place and the right approaches, and investing in the right places to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all aspects of the community through the recovery phase in the next 6 to 12 months and beyond. So what we'll be doing is reviewing the strategic risk register in light of the COVID-19 response and the risks we've identified in the report tonight, and to bring you back an updated risk register for the strategic risk register in the September meeting, looking at how we amalgamate these short-term immediate risks now with the sort of medium-term risks we'd normally see in the strategic risk register. So I'm happy to pause there and take any questions.
Can I just make one point, just for people who are beaming in around the world for this? Can you elaborate on gold and silver meetings?
I can indeed. So in normal emergency planning terms, you will have a situation where there's a gold structure that's set up to oversee the emergency arrangements of the council. It's chaired by the Chief Executive. attended by various directors, and the leader of the council and deputy leader have been attending, and they're there to take urgent decisions and actions that are required in relation to an emergency response. Typically, that would be something that would last for a matter of days in emergency planning terms, but COVID-19 has been like nothing else. That arrangement, which actually was happening on a daily basis at the beginning of the outbreak, has now sort of gone down to a weekly meeting, but it's still there to make sure that any emergency decisions, any emergency actions that need to be taken can be taken. It's also making sure that we're overseeing things like the local outbreak control plans, which have just been agreed, to make sure we have all these arrangements in place to meet our statutory duties. The silver, so that's the strategic level, the gold command. The silver meetings are very much a tactical and operational level, so the directors and heads of service on those to make sure that we actually coordinate all the kind of issues and impacts that COVID-19 is having on our services, on our residents, on our contractors, on our staff, to make sure that we're citing all the risks. And actually, it's been a real sort of a real positive, as Taryn mentioned before, the sort of collaborative working across directorates through those arrangements has been really powerful in the response so far, and it's something that has really helped to make sure that we are joining up in terms of our response to business, for example, where there are a number of different directorates who are involved in either supporting through funding or advice, or through safety, through enforcement, to make sure we're joined up in the way that we support different aspects of the community.
Thank you. Right, so questions. Charles is first up.
Yes, I was going to ask about the increased use of home working by staff. It seems to me this is both, insofar as we presumably will continue it to some extent, it's both an opportunity, perhaps in some cases to work more efficiently, to help with recruitment and retention, but there are also risks, not least, I think, perhaps in IT security. Was this identified as a particular risk when we moved into lockdown?
It certainly was. So we moved very quickly from a situation where a few hundred people each day might be working from home to within a couple of days where 2,500 to 3,000 people were working from home at the same time. And there had been some testing done of the IT infrastructure, because we could see this was coming, and that meant that we were able fairly quickly to be fully operational throughout the piece. There's some authorities who've not been so lucky in terms of the way that they're set up, and have not been able to have all staff being able to work remotely from pretty much day one. I mean, you very much make the point rightly about there are potential benefits for both staff and delivery of services to these sort of arrangements, which we're learning from. But also there's an impact on staff as well. So I mean, I know Debbie Morris, our director of HR and OD, is on the call as well, yeah. Where we've been very clear about individual risk assessments for staff who are either in at-risk groups, or where there may be consequences for them in terms of working constantly from home that may not be good for their health and well-being. So it's making sure we take account of that. In terms of the planning is going on in terms of how do we phase back face-to-face services. There are limitations, as you're probably aware, in terms of the COVID secure arrangements the government announced, which includes sort of social distancing and other measures within the workplace, where currently we can hold about 400 staff in the town hall safely under the COVID secure arrangements. So that's quite a lot lower than we would normally have had in the town hall prior to lockdown. Now, as those sort of the lockdown arrangements ease, we can see that might increase. But again, that's going to be quite a slow process, we think. So I think we recognise that we're working well generally in terms of the current arrangements, but there is a need to make sure that face-to-face services can happen appropriately as well for local residents. So it's trying to make sure we're managing the risks for all concerned through that process.
Thank you very much.
Next question is David.
David, this it's not directly for you, except you may be able to ensure that the questions are asked. And I don't want to underplay the seriousness of coronavirus, but roughly from the figures that I've seen, if you have about 45,000 dead in the population in this country of about 60 million, that makes it about 0.75 dead per 1,000. Has there been any planning by anyone, if suppose you had casualty rates, deaths I mean, of 5 per 1,000, So in other words, 300,000, not 45,000 in the country, and what that would look like in this borough. In other words, a real, I mean, and please don't say that I'm not saying this is not serious. For those people,
no,
yes,
no, indeed,
very
yeah,
serious.
indeed, yeah.
But compared with what it could be,
yeah.
I think that's the point I'm getting.
Yeah.
And I just would like to know that either you or public or our public health team have been thinking through some of the nastier what if scenarios.
Indeed.
Because that has clear implications of going concern in a different context.
It does, and that's really helpful, Councillor Lindsay. So in terms of the gold structure I mentioned earlier, public health are a key part of the gold command structure, and we've been regularly reviewing with them the data that they're getting from Public Health England and looking at different scenarios. And as you say, they're perhaps not quite as extreme as the scenario you mentioned, but looking at certainly where if there were significantly higher numbers of cases within the borough, how would the services that we're responsible for be impacted, both in terms of our residents and our staff, and also the capacity that there is within the system. As you say, particularly the National Health Service, we know that government did a lot of planning and investing to look at higher numbers than we had in this first, if we call it the first wave. But we are planning now through the local outbreak control plans for the potential for a second wave or local outbreaks of significant numbers into the autumn, so making sure we're fully stocked in terms of PPE, making sure that staff are fully aware of the risk assessments, are being trained in how to use PPE, that actually our services are being delivered in a safer way as possible. I think the other point you made, which I'll pick up on Councillor Dent-Coates' point earlier, is that the impact is whilst absolutely tragic in terms of those who've died and those who've had relatives or friends or colleagues who've died as a result of COVID, there is an unknown quantifiable impact in terms of the wider health of the population, which I think is again something that's going to impact on both children's and adult care services over the coming months and years. That's something we'll begin to see more of, and I know that Public Health and Public Health England colleagues in particular are working on modelling around some of those impacts as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think I have a slightly different view. I'm not sure there will be a second one of this particular coronavirus that has many viruses. It will be what you might call COVID-20 or COVID-25. I don't know when that might have those characteristics, but that is speculation. But I would very much want people to be thinking about it now.
And the other, absolutely we are. So the other thing we were discussing actually last week at the Gold meeting was around the potential for another pandemic of a different sort to occur at the same time as what we're in now. So again, making sure we've got capacity in those key services, particularly around public health, around the frontline services, around environmental health and enforcement and so on, to make sure we have some plans in place for in that eventuality as well. So these are scenarios we're working through to make sure we can put appropriate plans in place.
Thanks, David. Next question, Emma.
Thank you, Chair. I've been actually my question is kind of involves quite a lot of things that have just come up. The whole thing about the accuracy of recording how many people have died and so on. It's very difficult. Partly, the general death rate has reduced because a lot of the more frail people have died early, if you like. Obviously. I've been monitoring this quite closely, and I'm just looking for excess deaths, and the figures are coming out, I think, at the end of the month. So I think the only way to work out how many of our residents have actually passed away is looking at 6 months last year, first 6 months of last year, first 6 months of this year. It wasn't a bad winter that year, it wasn't a bad winter this year, and that will give us far more accurate than anything else, because people who have died within the borough, some of them aren't our residents, and some of our residents have
Indeed.
That's I've been trying to work out that. So aside from that, we have a lot of our diabetes rate is awful, especially in North Kent, especially under some communities, and they are very, very vulnerable. And by chance, my niece works on that. She's doing work in the East End on diabetes and COVID, so I'm seeing all kinds of very fresh information on that.
Indeed.
There's something again about monitoring, which is very difficult here, specifically in this borough. Now, I've got friends all over London who are work for councils, where the councils have just stepped up. They've had everything happening within the council, you know, their big hall or wherever they've rented somewhere, and they are the centre of everything, all the food and everything. We can't do that here. One of many, many reasons is the trust issue that we still have among many communities here. And this is something we found, because I'm just looking at page 15, reference 14, about strengthening data collection. I don't know how we're going to do that, because a lot of our food banks won't monitor, they won't take people's data, or if they ask for it, those that like to, people refuse to give it. And we've had quite a lot of that. People only feel free to come and get food if they're not going to be monitored, and because they don't trust the council, and that's a huge shame, but that's just a reality of it. I was involved in a meeting about this, and one of the senior officers concerned was saying, well, we have to find out whether it's a want or need. I thought, oh, that's that's, you know, some people come because they're lonely, not hungry, and that's also a need. So, you know, this kind of value judgment thing coming in makes it very, very difficult. So there's not really a question there. I'm just, you know, the idea of monitoring, you know, there are some organisations that are just giving food to whoever wants it or needs it, whoever asks for it, and they're just counting numbers and not people, you know, or who they are, and that's how. If we need to rely on monitoring who's coming to get things, I don't think we're going to get accurate figures. So it's just a general point really about accuracy. This the excess death thing. We're going to find out at the end of the week.
If I can start on that specifically, I mean, that's a really good point, because we know that there's been the reporting across the country has been about the deaths that occur within a borough rather than the residents of the borough who have died. And so the registrar's information is very much based on who has died in the borough. So if you have hospitals based in the borough, you will pick up registrations of those deaths, but you won't pick up deaths of those residents who actually died elsewhere, if it's another hospital or another location. Now, the Office for National Statistics have been producing information, but that's about 6 weeks behind the Public Health England data. But that's now, I think, starting to catch up. You mentioned there's some reporting that's happening later this week, I think. I think there's much more of a move now to get that. So public health colleagues are certainly working and pushing Public Health England to make sure they can get that data locally, because it's really important in terms of looking at where the sort of the issues are, where they can potentially look at increased support or intervention. It's going to be really important in terms of local outbreak control if we have that sort of situation, knowing where that is already. And again, because London boroughs are typically, and Kensington is one of the smallest ones, quite small, getting some data that is not personalised effectively, is trying to get that at a very local level can be difficult. But I know public health colleagues are working very closely with PHE to address that. I mean, you're right, public health colleagues have been talking about some of the disparities that, you know, the Public Health England report talked about, and particularly around the rate of diabetes within the borough and other conditions, underlying conditions, which, you know, as an authority we've got to work out how do we make sure we get the message across to different communities effectively.
Actually, there was a paper about air pollution affecting.
Yes. Indeed, yeah. So I think you're absolutely right there. With there's lots that is happening. There's lots we need to be doing to make sure we're able to see where issues are, and to be able to see what we can do as a local authority. Again, you're right. You know, trust is an important issue, and there are issues about people who would not want to give the council their data, but we are trying to work with voluntary and community sector partners to provide some of this, but again, that's not easy. So again, I can get some more information from Tunde Oluyinka, who's the new director of communities, on that, and perhaps a conversation with him, because he can talk about the work they're doing with the VCS partners to
communicated or by proxy.
Indeed. And I think you made a really good point about want versus need, which is a horrible way to put it. I think there's a recognition. So the shielding arrangements nationally, you know, are coming to an end, but the council's very much recognised that it now has contact with and responsibility for a whole load of vulnerable individuals it didn't necessarily know about before. and it's certainly working to embed. So the hub, as it is going to become part of the wider customer delivery service, but very much focused on providing ongoing support to individuals in that group, that shielding group.
I'm in the shielding group, by the way, because I'm recovering from cancer. But you know, I've had to tell them I'm absolutely fine.
No, I understand that, but I think
experience.
Yes, so I think they've got to a smaller number of individuals, so they recognise they're going to need that ongoing support and contact. So that's being put in place now, and it helps again if there is a second wave. We've got those arrangements to be able to reinitiate them, because again the reality is, you know, the food delivery service is something that government are sort of paring back on. These are things which we're going to need to make sure we can provide local support on.
It's awful. It's just horrific. It's just not good. It's not nutritious. It's which is why I'm very grateful that a lot of organisations are doing a fresh food.
Yes.
They're doing it just free.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
That's really helpful feedback. And in terms of these are very much the kind of things on the sort of the gold radar each week in terms of the risk register. It's something we need to make sure we keep that focus, and we're making sure we're doing everything we can to mitigate those sort of issues that you've talked about there, which is really helpful.
Thank you, David. You know, in terms of your sort of reflections on lessons learned and what we could do better next time, and actually what we can do, you know, next time there is a pandemic or actually just generally in the council, I think it would be really useful, so once the dust has settled, to bring a report to this committee in terms of what we have learned and how we can do things better. You know, your example of now having more information about who is vulnerable in the borough and how we can help them, into to how we can work remotely better and cut maybe space in the office or whatever it is. I do hope somebody is sort of keeping good notes on how we have responded to this pandemic and how we could improve on that next time. And everything is being sort of documented. So if this horror repeats itself with the David Lindsay COVID-20, then at least we have a bit of a sort of roadmap. And I think, you know, Asia obviously had a better roadmap than us because they dealt with SARS and MERS and everything like that. We need to build our own sort of roadmap, and I think it's a responsibility of this committee to ensure that we have that for the future.
Indeed, I can assure you through the emergency planning team, that's something that's been very much being done from very early days in terms of recording, obviously what we're doing, but what we're learning from the response as well, which I think, as you say, is really important for the prospect of, you know, sort of future outbreaks or for another flare up. Yeah, absolutely.
Chairman agreed.
The what? You're agreed?
The vice chairman is agreeing with the chairman in such a way that he wants it to be noted.
Yes, Mr. Carver notes everything. What noted about the David Lindsay COVID-20 prediction?
No, but both points. But your general point that we need to make sure that we have something to take off, just to take off and implement straight away in the event of a future scenario that may or may not be similar to this one.
Yeah,
indeed.
Great. I think we've got no further questions. So I think, David, you now take a mini break, and we've got
thank you.
A8. Thank you, David. Excellent as always. A8, which is Treasury. We haven't got Mike Curtis, so who have we got?
We've got Matt Dawson.
Oh, hello, Matt. How are you?
Hi.
Good. Right, over to you.
Thank you very much. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Matt Dawson. So my remit is oversight of the Tri-Boroughs Treasury and over the three boroughs. So this is one of three statutory reports that we take to this committee every year, although RBKC, you do go over and above, and we actually present this report once a quarter. So the reason I'm saying that is that the format of this report will be familiar to many of you. So I'd like to start at 3.1, which gives you your net cash position as at the start of the financial year and the end of the financial year, 31st of March 20. So relatively stable net cash balance. I'll talk about the borrowing in year and the investment makeup, but it's quite a useful table as it gives you the asset allocation as to where those investments were and the rate as at the year end. At 3.2, Taryn's already alluded at A5 to the budget versus actual. So on interest paid, there wasn't the amount of borrowing that was initially thought we'd need. So there were only 2 transactions in the year, 2 tranches of 25 million at a rate of a shade under 2.5%, which actually, with everything that happens, those rates still stack up today. They were 2 very good deals. We didn't take the rest of the allocation, hence the underspend. And on interest received, there was an opportunity in the year to lend to councils and banks. There was a time where there was a premium. So we did take that opportunity, and that led to a very welcome bit of over recovery in respect of income. If we look at the section 4, 4.1 just says what I've just told you, i.e. the PWLB debt in the year. So 50 million new borrowing and a 5 million maturity. So 4.2 then breaks that down into a profile. Now, there are controls in place as part of the Prudential Code that stops all of your debt maturing in any given period, but this is actually quite a nice spread out towards 40 years. And obviously, as the rates would indicate, the long-ended debt, so the 20, 30 years, the 30, 40 years, by their very definition, are more recent loans, which is why the weighted average rate of those loans are much smaller. So as the older loans mature, the portfolio rate will actually come down. Section 5 just goes into a bit more detail. I'm not planning on covering that here, but it just puts a bit of evidence behind why we borrowed what we did. Section 6, important. No breaches in the year. Everything we did, all transactions that we placed on your behalf, everything was in compliance with the strategy you set and the Treasury Management Strategy Statement. That's actually summarised in 7.1. So everything we did was permissible in 7.1. If I could move on to 7.4 now, please. There were a couple of base rate cuts, as we all know, in March. But this is where we ended the financial year, and it's very difficult to not talk about the last few months. It's tough enough presenting an outturn report without the last few months that we've had. But how this looks different now, money market funds, we are holding a lot more money in money market funds because of the uncertainties that we've talked about extensively at this meeting. So whereas we would have had 60 million or 58.2 million at year end in liquid money market funds, we're now holding typically 90, 100 million on any given day in a money market fund. Now, when rates are where they are, that becomes a very easy sell because we're not giving up a lot of upside. So you'll see the weighted average rate on money market funds at year end was 0.45% or 45 basis points, we prefer to call it. As at now, money market funds are probably running you 15 basis points. So there's probably been 2/3 of that performance knocked off, and that happens as money market fund paper matures. They're replacing it at a lower rate, and we'd expect that to decrease further. With banks and locals, well, the weighted average rate, it's holding up at the moment because you're accruing at a time when there was a higher interest rate, but there will come a time when those deals mature. We will be renewing at not very much money. If we look at the forward rates, it's not quite pricing in negative, but it's certainly pricing in flat. In fact, Treasury bills, we're now being not that RBKC have got an exposure to Treasury bills, but Treasury bills are on the verge of being negative. Section 8 just puts into a graph exactly what happened to interest rates and why that happened, and gives a very useful quarterly average rate versus the 7-day rate. So it just summarizes the year quite nicely. I'm not going to talk about the appendices other than to say that Appendix A relates to the prudential indicators, and it just shows us complying. That by far and away the most important prudential indicator is the authorised limit. So no matter what happens in any given year, the amount that we cannot breach is 415 million pounds of borrowing, which we didn't. And Appendix B just shows, it breaks the local authorities and bank exposure down to the next level in case you're interested to see where those deposits were. And I'll take questions.
Thank you very much. David Lindsay.
Thank you, Ian. My question relates to the very last thing you were talking about, Appendix B. We know that some local authorities are in a financially much tighter position than others, and some are in a much tighter position than K&C. But I've no idea which they are, and it would be very helpful if you could give a verbal update as to whether you consider any of these to be in a precarious place. But also, has somebody consolidated it? So suppose Moray Council, which is clearly in Scotland, and I imagine might be quite small, but if they had borrowed quite a lot from lots of different authorities in England and indeed elsewhere in Scotland, I would be concerned, because if a lot of people are owed a lot of money by a relatively small authority, that is a risk.
Thank you. So the one of the unique things we do at the Tri-Borough is we do a full due diligence on local authorities before we lend to them. So that's not the norm. I hadn't heard of it before I started at the Tri-Borough, but actually on reflection, I'm glad that we do. And we do say no to certain locals. So what we've nearly completed doing, following the end of the financial year, we are delving into the draft accounts, because we really need those draft accounts to get a steer on this. We're pretty much there for Westminster. The other two councils, we might be waiting for a couple of authorities, but I'll certainly share that with the committee, because it's something that we care very, very deeply about. There are we can have a discussion offline about what the controls in place for in the event that a local authority defaults. The problem is that's never happened before. So outside of a public meeting, we could certainly, as a team, we could sit down with the committee and go through and analyse the names. But as I say, that has not happened before, and the risk put on those transactions at year end is zero, because we believe there are controls in place.
David, we have sort of interrogated this a few times over the last couple of years, in terms of what is the risk of default and what happens if a council was to default. And we've always been reassured that, Her Majesty's government would step in and soak up the responsibility.
And I have two, Ian, I have two quick responses. One is, this is an unprecedented time.
Yeah,
and the second is, I remember probably about 25 years ago, there were a number of authorities, including Hammersmith and Fulham, that invested in Iceland. And
I see Charles nodding his head ferociously.
And I'm not saying that these are comparable. All I'm saying is that there were problems then, and the government managed to get the local authorities out. And sorry, this is me giving a personal view by saying that they were acting ultra vires. because there were a number of authorities that couldn't afford the quite large numbers of millions that they were going to lose. So I just flag it up as something that may not be an issue as at the end of the year, but extreme care needed. And I'm not saying that means that we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying extreme care needed on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, so I think it was 2009 when councils had deposited money in iSave accounts,
Okay,
which was owned by an Icelandic bank. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And that was sort of money's lost. So rather than the councils defaulting, they'd lost their hard-earned cash.
Yeah,
but I'm totally with you, David. This is why I brought it up multiple times before over the last couple of years. In this risk, that it is a risk. I'm not entirely sure I agree it's near enough zero, but we shall defer that. Next question. Sorry, Charles. Yeah, Charles, over to you.
Unmute. Yes, sort of slightly related. Yes, this council, I think, has always valued low risk against over maximum returns, and that's why we kept well clear of Iceland. But in the times when interest rates may do some very strange things, possibly Mike and the leadership team member might want to change the criteria under which Matt and his team operate. If that were the case, would this committee be consulted?
If there is a sea change in, I'll come up with the scenario because that might help frame it. So let's just say I'm old enough to remember when Euro money market funds went negative. So I was working for a pension fund at the time. So overnight, we simply stopped investing in those funds. We left the money in a general fund and earned nothing. So let's assume rates go negative. So in the event that we then would take a similar view that we do everything we could to avoid negative rates, that's more than this committee. To be fully compliant, we'd have to take a revised Treasury Management Strategy statement to full council. Right. Even with the smallest of amendments, otherwise it would be a reportable event, and we've acted outside our remit.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. No more questions, no more hands up. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Now we're moving on to A9, which is on the IBC, and who's doing this? Taryn and Debbie?
Yes, evening.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Chair. So I'm just going to say a couple of words, and then I think, again, we think the report hopefully has given a detailed update, but we'll open for questions. So just to kind of remind the committee, so at the last meeting we provided, Debbie and I were here, provided a verbal update on progress, but the committee wanted to see a kind of a written update. So a lot has happened in terms of progress since the last meeting, I think you said in February. So we tried to give you a kind of a bit of background from the kind of implementation December 2018 right up until now. Happy to take any questions. I think I'll certainly cover all the finance ones. Debbie obviously is here for kind of HR. What I would say just in terms of progress, and I think it's important to kind of flag it from the start because obviously you would have read it in the report, is that certainly on the finance side, so you'll be aware that actually embarking on IBC required us to embed certainly some new processes within finance. We're definitely on a journey on that. So we've made some really good progress, but I think it's important that we're honest with you. And I think it's set out in the report that we've still got a little way to go. There's some really good plans in place for the next 12 months. But actually, I think it's important that committee know that we've still got some work to do in that area. So that's all I was going to say. Hopefully the report it gives quite a lot of background, but really open up for questions straight away.
Well, if I may kick off, I think we had Barry Quirk in the meeting in December. I think it was sort of early Christmas present for the committee. And we did interrogate him. One of the things we were talking about was staff retention and where staff were going, if they did leave us, and turnover, etc. And he was struggling to get the data on that. And we did ask him to sort of give us an update on a regular update on where we were on that data. Do we now have better data on the system? Are we able to extract that? And the idea behind it, the questioning behind it, was that we knew where people were going. We're talking about culture change, where people were going, why they were going to other places. Yeah, over to you, Karen, or Debbie, possibly. I think Debbie was in the meeting.
I wasn't in that meeting,
okay.
But I can answer the question.
Great.
So we did have some difficulty extracting the data from the system, and recently we now have a complete data set that's delivered to the borough, and we are working through Power BI to try to extract some of that data. So we are in a better position than we was. We're not entirely where we need to be. The staff turnover is the average across London, which was about 16%. We have introduced exit interviews, which are not compulsory for staff to complete.
Brilliant.
But we are starting to get some meaningful data. Primarily what that's showing us at the moment from the staff that are leaving the authority, the majority are going to another authority, sometimes for pay, sometimes because the role is nearer home. We know that as London Borough, the majority of our staff do not live in the borough. We have a very small percentage of staff that live locally. So we are gathering the data, and the data sets are getting better.
I'm delighted to hear that, Debbie. Thank you very much for your work on that. We've got a question from Charles.
Yes, purchase orders. When I first joined this committee, I think purchase orders were hardly used at all. I think the BT system, whatever its other numerous faults, I think did push us into using them. So I was slightly surprised to see that they aren't as widely used as perhaps they should be. Are we going to be making progress in the next year on this?
Yeah, so I mean, you picked up on, there were a couple of areas within finance that are really focused over the next 12 months. So, you know, no PO, no pay, which is what we call it, certainly was talked about in kind of when BT was our provider, but it was never fully enforced. Now, it is a requirement of the new system. Now, it's a very, very significant culture change here in Kensington. So we're making some good progress, and we're actually, so we came out of so that was probably the one thing that was holding us coming out of stabilization back at the beginning of the year. So we have kind of reached a target that we needed to kind of get us onto what we call our business as usual processes. But you'll see we're still a very, very long way from where we need to be. So finance are certainly leading on a very targeted approach over the next 12 months. I do think it may take 12 months to kind of address some areas, but we are very much, that is our focus. And we've signed up with the IBT so every quarter we will have a slightly revised target. So we've just literally had our latest data. Even despite through COVID, some good progress has been made, which just shows that we are getting there, but there's still an awful long way to go. I think generally there is something around compliance. So certainly we are targeting that compliance culture within the organisation to say this is the process going forward, and there will come a time when actually no PO, no pay is fully implemented. It just takes a bit, it's not something we can achieve overnight. And you could argue, well, we're 18 months down the line from embedding IBC, but we're getting there. But absolutely, that's where we want to be in 12 months' time. So hopefully when I give the update to the committee in 12 months' time, we've got where we need to be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taryn. Next question, Emma.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks for asking that one, Charles. That was going to be my first question. So I've got a question and then another bit. My question is on page 9, 12.3. I find it a bit concerning that these budget managers are struggling with this forecasting and budget monitoring functionality, and only 30% of them are using the system, etc., etc. That's given where we are with our money, I find that really, really worrying. That people are still struggling with the system, which I'm sure is not user friendly like some other things aren't, but it's so that's just a concern I want to leave with you. The other one was about Debbie may be able to correct me on this, an issue about senior directors, of which we have 3 times more than Hammersmith and Fulham, but a colleague has just been doing some interviewing recently and was surprised that they're only doing interviewing one director. So I don't know if this happened at the end of a long process and this is just a kind of confirmatory thing, or if there's an issue about getting senior directors into the borough for some reason, a reputational issue, which somebody had suggested outside the borough, had said, well, who would want to work in Kensington Chelsea now? So that might be very unfair, but I'm just worried about that. So firstly, about people managing their budgets and monitoring them. And the other one, are we getting enough people applying for senior jobs?
Okay, shall I take the budget forecasting? So what I would say is that, again, a system will support that, but there is some work that we need to do about accountability and ownership with budget managers, and that hasn't necessarily been our focus. Our focus has been absolutely on kind of dealing with the no PO, no pay and kind of the kind of invoices part of the system. There is some work that we need to do actually. But to be fair, lots of budget managers are managing their budget. The step that we haven't yet quite fully achieved is that using the system to do that. So that's certainly so in finance, and I think I've documented it in the report, we are looking at all of this in the round. You know, it is around account, you know, as a budget manager, your responsibility for, you know, purchase orders and invoices, you're responsible for your budget. So that is certainly something that we are driving forward. There is a lot of room for improvement here at Kensington, but we do have a plan. So, you know, I know I've just answered the question about POs, but it's exactly the same conversation with the same people about their budgets as well. But I would say the gap is really in terms of the just using the system for the forecasting. This is not saying that they're not doing it. We just want to get into a position where they're using the system to do it, which should be a relatively easy thing to do. Once you're trained on a system, it's fine. But yeah, we're going on a bit of a journey. So hopefully in 12 months time, well, not 12, 9 months time, I've set myself a target to the end of March. So when I'm sat here in 9 months time, hopefully it's a very different story.
Okay, thank you. It's reassuring.
Evening, Councillor. With regards to staffing, as part of the Chief Executive's forward plan, just before Christmas, we advertised a number of director roles and one executive director role. We had a pretty overwhelming response and we made 6 senior appointments, most of which started with us around March, April this year, just as we were into lockdown. So I don't think we have a problem attracting the talent into the organisation. With regard to the most recent appointment that you reference, we did have more than one candidate for final panel, but we had somebody withdraw, and so the process went through the correct process. But sadly, when we went to members panel, we presented one candidate only.
Okay, all right. So people still want to work here. That's something.
Absolutely, okay. Very much so.
Reassuring. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And question from David.
I think for both Debbie and Taryn, what are your one key concerns that you have that are keeping you awake at night? Or maybe they're not keeping you awake at night, they're just niggling.
So from my point of view, I think the workforce has done extremely well around the period of COVID. I think we had a lot of staff that were redeployed at short notice and reskilled in order to keep the hub open for our residents that were shielding, to keep the back open for the emergency room, and also registrars. We have been maintaining a lot of health and wellbeing support for staff that have been sick, including contacting them personally throughout this time touch wood, we've had no debtors in service in our BKC, which is great news for us. And we obviously hope that continues. I suppose my worry would be if we do get a second wave, you know, the resilience of the workforce with sickness, etc. Saying that, I'm confident that all of the services have their business continuity plans in place. As David and Taryn referenced in response to an earlier question, I think we're well placed to respond. So it's just the unknown really around COVID going forward would be what slightly keeps me awake at night.
Okay, and for me, I think we've talked a lot about the financial position tonight. So it is that, and I think it's the amount that we've got to do within a relatively short period of time to address both the current year and next year. But also, you know, I can't achieve all of that on my own. So it's a council-wide and a kind of an organisational approach that we need. So it's just making sure that across the whole organisation, both officers, members, actually we're all kind of moving in the same direction would be the thing for me, because we've got an awful lot to achieve. From an IBC perspective, it's about making sure that, like I say, in 9 months' time, you know, we will be 2.5 years having implemented IBC, that we have addressed all those financial processes and they're all fully embedded across the organisation. And again, can't do that on my own. I'm absolutely relying on kind of working across services to achieve that.
Thank you, Taryn. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you both.
That was great. Moving on swiftly to A10. This is on the property portfolio, and I believe Anna is going to be doing this. And Anna, welcome to your first Audit and Transparency Committee meeting. Anna was one of our outstanding recruits who joined us during lockdown. Is that correct? Or just before lockdown?
So I'm going to, at risk of spoiling your introduction of Anna, this is Dan Hawthorne. I'm the new Executive Director for Housing and Social Investment. I was going to start by saying something. Anna is also joining us and will be available to answer questions at the end. But I won or lost the toss, put it in terms of introducing this item. So
you as well. You also joined post lockdown.
I did, yeah, I did.
Yet to spend a day in the town hall, yeah.
One day so far.
1 day. Thank you.
So I'm going to kind of do, you've got the paper in front of me. I'm not going to repeat it all. I'm just going to kind of introduce it in 3 parts, really. Firstly, just briefly to describe the property portfolio itself. Secondly, to describe the kind of framework which guides us in terms of how we lease out that property to third parties. And then a specific focus on 4 particular properties that we agreed to focus on in discussion with the chair. So the portfolio first. So setting aside the housing portfolio that's in the housing revenue account, we have a total portfolio that comprises 674 different properties. Some residential properties that we hold in the general fund, which we acquired for residents after the Grenfell disaster. That's not the focus of today's discussion, really. Plus 284 commercial properties and 134 operational ones, as well as 2 heritage assets. So the crucial thing to say is that although we don't include in that analysis the homes we hold in the housing revenue account, we do hold commercial property in the housing revenue account. Some of that commercial property is held in the HRA because it forms part of a housing estate. So some of the rent that comes through that portfolio does get channeled into the HRA, but most of it comes into the general fund. And as you've already heard from Taryn and others, our income from this property portfolio is one of the largest COVID-related pressures on the budget corporately. Today's paper doesn't focus on that issue, but that issue it does feel like an important part of the backdrop for what we're talking about tonight. So then, in terms of kind of how we let that property out and the kind of framework, the statutory framework and so on that guides that, the prevailing law that covers all business tenancies, whoever the landlord is the 1954 Landlord and Tenant Act, which sets out the roles and responsibilities, who's responsible for rent, repairs, service charges, etc. But you can grant a lease, as it's called, inside or outside that act, and that's done by agreement between the two parties at the time that the lease starts. And if it's outside the act, then there's an agreed declaration that the tenant doesn't have a right of renewal. That's one of the most important things that falls out of that. But separately from that, there is also, because we're a local authority, we're obliged to demonstrate what's called best consideration under Section 123 of the 72 Local Government Act. And that shows that it requires us to show in making these decisions that we're getting value for money for property that we're leasing out. But it does explicitly allow us to strike a balance between, if you like, financial and non-financial returns. So if we're crudely, what that means is if we are renting something out for less than the market rate for any given property, we have to be able to show that that the non-financial returns are can be justified for that by taking that approach to the rent. And that is really important in the context of our emerging approach to the social investment approach to the way that we use our property, which is mentioned before. So then all decisions about leases have to follow, have to kind of comply with the council's kind of delegated authorities, and that depends on the value of the lease. That will then determine who is authorised to kind of sign it off, if that makes sense. And Anna, the new Director of Social Investment and Property, who you'll be hearing from later, has brought in a measure which makes the lead member and me, the exec director, so that's Councillor Taylor-Smith and me, make sure that even if we're not signing them off, that we are aware of lease changes that are taking place under delegated authority by Anna or her team. So then the 4 properties that are focused on in the report, in a way, are the properties which slightly straddle the categories, because they are operational buildings, but they have space within them that are let out to third parties. So they are the town hall itself, where the conference centre, bluntly, which we rent out kind of on a sessional basis, but where quite significant work is required to release the true potential of that venue, and we're going through the process of bidding for funds to make that investment. Lidgery Lodge, where there's a market-based lease which will come up for review, I think, later this year. And the car park underneath the town hall, where there's a long-term lease, but there's an option to break that, which I think we expect will be taken. So we'll be looking for a new tenant there, we expect. Then there's the Central Library in Kensington, where we rent out to a doctor's surgery and 2 other businesses. There's Chelsea Old Town Hall, where we rent out space to the Citizens Advice Bureau and to an organisation called Wimbletech, which works with our libraries. And then there's the Pembroke Road building, where we rent out space at a peppercorn to Opera Holland Park, and that's due to come up for a review in September 23. And we also let space there to the police for no charge. So that's a kind of brief canter through the headlines. Obviously, Anna and I are very happy to answer any specific questions you've got, either, if you like, about the general terms on which the portfolio is managed, or on the specifics of those 4 cases.
Thank you very much, Dan. Tom, are you with us? I'm just wondering about if we switch to Appendix or Section B, Part B. Is there anyone else on the line?
Yeah, no problem. If you want to switch to the Part B bit, just let me know and I'll pause the stream.
Okay, so what we shall do is we've all got Part B. If anyone's got a question on Part B, then say before your question, and we will then switch to Part B. If nobody has a question on Part B, then we'll carry on without cutting everyone else off. Okay, so first question is from Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And of course, I asked you to look at this specifically. I had a lot of concerns for quite a long time about how we let out our property and so on. So I've got 4 questions. They're all interlinked, really. I mean, firstly, I have periodically had people saying, people are taking the council for fools. They don't charge enough for certain things, and we're not looking at the social investment side of things at all. Basically, that commercial organisations have come in, and then the council, naively or not, or that's the perception of some, have let out a property cheaper than it should have been. And I won't mention any sums, Chair, so we don't need to go into Part B.
Okay.
But firstly, it was Nitry Lodge. That was specifically, I was specifically asked about Nitry Lodge. Maybe this has changed now. Of course, that may be different after the way people working and so on. I don't know how maybe they're not going to be able to continue with that. Who knows? The other one, obviously, the conference centre. It is really not a conference. It's not fit for purpose as a conference centre. It hasn't been for years. It doesn't have proper Wi-Fi. But it is also, this is my architectural historian coming out, it is a very, very special building. And if we mess it about like we did with the rest of the town hall, we just can't let that happen, because it's very beautiful. It can be upgraded without ruining it, because it is quite special. People, come and visit just to see the building, because it is rather lovely. But it really, really does need to be brought into the 21st century. So I agree with that. I'm really anxious about what plans are being put in place, and I'm going to ask about that. Thirdly, actually, the town hall, the actual offices. I'm just wondering, we spent a great deal of money for the Tri-Borough project a few years back. We spent 24 million transforming it, and then of course Tri-Borough has changed. And I'm just wondering if I don't want to put anybody out of a job or off a space. I just wonder if that space is being used correctly, if there are other ways of doing it. Is it ever as it should be at capacity? Or could we contract that a bit more if there are fewer people there? I'm not sure. So a bit of worry about that, the actual town hall. And finally, Pembroke Road, the future of Pembroke Road, because there were big plans for Pembroke Road, which have now changed. And I just wonder what our plans are for continuing to use that. And why on earth, how on earth did we agree to let Opera Holland Park park their offices and storage area? I didn't know they had 6 storage areas as well. That drives some people, and it's not only me, drives some people to distraction that we're supporting a failing business, actually. So that's 4 issues, really. Sorry. Nitry Lodge, are we charging them enough now? Mm-hmm. Conference centre, town hall, office space, and the continuing presence of Opera Holland Park in Pembroke Road and the future of that building. Sorry, that's my question.
Okay, good evening all. Apologies, but I'm standing on tiptoes in my bedroom because my Wi-Fi in the other room has failed. So if I wobble and get short, really sorry. Good evening all. I haven't met a lot of you. My name's Ella Bembo. Dan introduced me. I'm the Director of Social Investment and Property. I think one of the first things I want to say is I'm actually on a journey myself, having started just before lockdown. So my time has been distracted from lockdown, but I think some of the things, Councillor Denko, that you've just raised are actually quite important to me as well. So on the first thing on Nitry Lodge, there is a rent review period that is coming up. I have asked the team to do a comparator in terms of what we know the people are charging and how much our service charge would be, etc. So we have some data, and that will lead into the rent review period. Your second point was around the conference centre. Buildings are really, really important to me, and I agree with you. It's a beautiful building, and what we mustn't do is improve it to the detriment of the style, the look and the history. However, we are not going to be able to promote that as a conferencing centre if we don't improve improve some of the facilities, such as the Wi-Fi, such as the stairs carpet, such as the kitchen, such as the actual audio visual, which I think is based from 1980, and there's only one person that actually knows how to use it. So I have actually put a capital bid in so that we can actually understand how we can sensitively improve that. So the improvements that we're looking at are literally related to the background items as opposed to doing anything significant and changing the look and feel of the building, because I think it was built for a reason with some essence in it, and I don't want to lose that. You spoke about Pembroke Road and Op Holland Park. I believe there was about a year ago an update given on the minutes of one of these meetings regarding the date and timeline of when that is going to be reviewed. I'm sorry, I can't recall it off the top of my head, and I don't want to be checking emails while I'm standing here. But what I will do is, yeah.
Mad, 25 years nearly.
No, I completely will get back. Your comments about Kensington Town Hall, again, it's quite important to me that as leading on the operational portfolio as well as the commercial portfolio, we focus very much on effective asset management and using our assets to the best of their ability. Life moves on. So what we maybe looked at 3-4 years ago needs to be refreshed on a regular basis. And it's very important that we look at what has changed in the last 3 to 4 months. I didn't think I would be standing in my bedroom talking to you all now. I thought I would be in a committee room. So I think it's really important we reflect that, but we give ourselves time to reflect it. We understand what's going to happen when life settles down into the new status quo, because I don't like the term new normal, because then we do have to review and look at it. But again, we need to do it sensitively. We need to understand the core and heart of the building. But we also need to look and see what opportunities the situation may afford us. So I can't say that we have something in train now, but I do note it and what you're saying. And I think I will, out of interest, go back and understand some of the history from 3-4 years ago, so I can feed that into future plans.
Okay, thank you.
I might just add one thing to build on what Anna's said about Midgley Lodge, because Councillor Denkode, you asked in a way a kind of 2 or 3 part question, which is kind of firstly, how do we know at the time that we're letting it out that we're getting the right rate for it? But then also, how do we structure the lease in such a way that means that that remains true over the length of the lease and that we've got the opportunity to review it? So we took advice from we had external advisors, JLL, who supported us through that process. You know, with a big property like this one, it pays to have external advice to make sure exactly that we're not that we're behaving in a properly commercial way, and that advice will help us not only to set the right rent at that time, but to fix a lease which includes rent reviews, so that we can continue to satisfy ourselves and satisfy you that not only that it was value for money on day one, but that we've got the opportunity to kind of to keep going and for it not to kind of over the years become something where there's a great opportunity cost to the terms of the lease as it was originally set. So every time we set a lease, it's not just about the price you set on that day, it's about how you design it in such a way that makes it future proof as much as possible. Our view is that we have done that at Midgley Lodge, and the review that Anna mentioned that's coming up will be a chance to kind of refresh that position.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you very much. Next question is from David.
Slightly different sort of question. On paragraph 4.2, you refer to there being 134 operational assets with an asset value of 550 million. What will be the open market value of those? And there are notes on page 73 and 119, but they're not quite the same. And it may be that there is no open market value, but do you have a sense of what it might be?
I don't actually have a sense. That was an extract from the JLL valuation report that was done, and which was actually in train before I arrived. So if I can take that question away and get back to you. Absolutely. The valuation has been done on a fair value, capital F, capital V, and there is background to that. So I'll be able to detail a formal response to you.
Great. No more questions. Thank you very much, Dan and Anna. Great start. And I'm sure we'll hear again from you soon.
Many thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Right, moving on to A11. Is Moira doing this or David? Moira's doing it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Annual report on internal audit and internal controls.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Moira.
This is our annual report, which comes due at this time every year, obviously, and it wraps up the work that we've done during the year to give you some assurance on the risks and governance arrangements and the controls within the council. Some of the audits you'll have already be familiar with because we report to you on a regular basis, but this pulls together the whole complete amount of work that we've done in Appendix 3. It's all summarised in there. So there was quite a lot of work finished at the tail end of the financial year. Some of it dragged on a little bit because of COVID, unfortunately, but we have tried to include pretty much everything that we had fundamentally completed by the time of the end of the financial year. There's a couple of items in the appendix that show as draft. I apologise for that. They are technically still draft reports. We don't normally report draft reports, but they were okay. They weren't limited assurance or no assurance. We're just waiting for responses from the services, and they are in areas which are under a lot of pressure at the moment, or have been under a lot of pressure. So we've given them a bit of leeway on that, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware that we'd done the work. There were only 4 areas flagged up as requiring some improvement and gain limited assurance. A couple of these you're already aware of, which is the environmental services and the PCI DSS compliance. They were reported previously in the year, and these are progressing with recommendation implementations, and they will be followed up shortly. 2 new ones in there which came through at the end of the year. One was in client affairs and the other was cybersecurity. So client affairs is where the council has some responsibilities for vulnerable adults, where they have to look after their financial affairs and sometimes their possessions. This was a tri-borough service, and it was disaggregated probably about 2 years ago now, and it's taken a little bit of time to pull the systems together and get the right level of controls in place. But again, it's work is in hand. It just needs a little bit more clarity on who's responsible for what. Cybersecurity, I think, is a bit inevitable that would be limited. It's a fast-moving area, as you'll be aware. But the key for us here was that there needed to be a little bit more of a management and sort of council approach to what they expected their IT people to be doing on cybersecurity. So some proper buy-in on what was being done to manage the cybersecurity for the council. And I know that there is quite a bit of work going on now with engagement with the IT and the director of the exec director for resources to make sure that they are addressing the key risk areas in that respect, because it's a very expensive area to maintain, as you can imagine, and moving to remote working obviously increases those risks quite a lot. And like all councils, I think they've been hit by a lot of cyber attempts anyway in recent months due to the lockdown. That's all I was really going to say. I was just quite happy to answer any questions.
Right, first up for the questions is David.
Thank you. You talked the last thing you talked about was cybersecurity, and I mean, clearly it's in 3.7 and then it's in 2.4 further along. How good or poor is our cybersecurity? Should we be concerned? You slightly seem to say that actually everyone's got a problem, and that's maybe true, but given how reliant we are on cyber, we need to make sure that it works and that the systems are properly robust. And sorry, a very, very different question. How often do we look again at areas where there have been difficulties or issues in the past? And how frequently?
So the council does have a fairly robust plan of testing that they undertake on a routine basis, and to try and make sure they identify attacks and what they can do with those. I mean, they employ quite a large number of people to do that for them. One of the key issues we had was that there needed to be a bit more of a flow down from the top of what was expected and an understanding of what was being done to address the cybersecurity for the council, and that structure wasn't really in place. That was our main concern. So I think there'll always be risks. We weren't that critical about what they were doing to manage those risks, but it needed to be more structured, and that's what we were looking for. That's why it received a limited assurance. What they do about it is regularly reported, but obviously you have to be careful about what you report on cyber risk, because you don't want to let everyone know what's going on within your council or your organisation. And that's, again, is about making sure that the structures are in place, that the right people who have the responsibility and the accountability are aware of what's happening and what measures are being taken to manage those risks.
Thank you, Maura. Next question from Cosette, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question was also about cybersecurity, but a slightly different one. And this is perhaps a bit off piece, so apologies. I wanted to ask, are there any arrangements in place from an insurance perspective with regard to cybersecurity?
That's a good question. I might have to call on David here.
Just trying to unmute, sorry. That's something we can certainly come back with some more information. We have a full range of policies that cover all sorts of risks, but I'm happy to come back with a written response on that in terms of the specifics.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
And Martin, I'm sure, have made a note of that. And then Liz, next question.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Chair. Internal audit's a very important line of defence, and I'm concerned about the cyber, particularly in the current sort of situation that we're in, and also the drop in scores from 90% down to 83% overall. But also, I know that a lot of the work has been paused, and some of the work that couldn't be completed in the financial year on page 11. But there's no, we heard how external audit could continue with their work. They could obtain evidence, and also there was a number of audits deferred. And I just wondered, it is a very important line of defence, and what was proposed in order to sort of catch up on this, so we can have assurance that the internal controls are working effectively.
Okay, yes, that's absolutely a very, very important point. I think, unfortunately, for some of the pieces of work, the timing was really difficult because they were in areas which were very challenged at the beginning, at the tail end of the financial year. For example, we had already had meetings about deprivation of liberty standards, charging for SEN, youth services. A lot of these we'd actually had conversations, and we were literally about to start the field work when they were suddenly inundated with the response required for COVID. So they were literally in the last 6 weeks or so of the financial year. Inevitably you have work in the last 6 weeks of the financial year. Those pieces of work will still happen. In fact, at least half of them are already now in progress. They just got pushed back. So it was a priority thing. Some of them didn't need to be done because we'd had conversations with the departments about what the risks were, and they had already done things in the year to address those risks. The GDPR thing at the bottom, some advisory work that we wanted to do with resources and assets to make sure that we were managing that process across the council. That started in about May time, so during lockdown. So we do continue, but we had to reprioritise. And anything that's on that list of deferred items that needs to be undertaken will be in this year's plan. We talked about that very briefly. We did bring a plan to you in February. It was quite high level. That's been modified. Obviously, a lot of the work is being focused into different risk areas, but there are a number of these pieces of work which will continue, and I plan to redistribute that plan to you so that you're aware of what's coming down the line. And hopefully you'll get some update in September on some of the progress that we've been able to make.
And I think just to add to that, if I may, so while we've paused some planned audit work, we've actually been giving and getting assurance on kind of emergency arrangements in place during the lockdown as well. So we've been supporting the organisation in a number of areas, whether it's in terms of the grants being paid out to local businesses, around the sort of the capital programme, and various other aspects of helping to, so from an advisory point of view, to set up the new processes and systems which were required in the hub for the outbreak control plans. There's a number of things we've been doing instead of some of the audit work we would have typically been doing. And it gives us a chance, as Maura's been saying there, to reassess where we are in terms of the key risks we need to focus on for the rest of the year. I think your point as well was a good one about the drop in that there's a positive assurances. Now that's very much because we have a risk-based plan. So actually, if we're in the 80s, that's quite good. But again, we need to be making sure that we're focusing on the areas of risk, but actually the organisation is doing the same. So again, it's a really good indicator of whether that's slipping or not. And it's a bit of a step back from the previous year, but not something that is a significant cause for concern for me at present.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then no more questions. We're moving on to A12 now, which is the anti-fraud end of year report. David, up again.
Which I'll ask Andy Hyatt, who's our head of fraud, to introduce his paper, if that's okay, Chair. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully the paper itself is fairly evident, so I'm going to do a very brief intro. The report covers the counter-fraud activity across the organisation from the 1st of April 2019 to the 31st of March 2020. I'm just really going to draw your attention to the output. Draw your attention to the output table, which is 1.5, but actually goes over the page onto page 2, and possibly preempt some questions by just giving an explanation why there was a reduction perhaps in fraud proved in comparison to the last financial year, and also value. Two areas where amounts dropped. I think first and foremost, we've seen a reduction in right to buy applications. Not as many people are looking to right to buys at the moment, so there was a reduction in that. So weren't as many frauds identified. And finally, at the bottom there, Grenfell frauds. There wasn't as many, and as you are aware, some of the Grenfell frauds are quite high values, and there wasn't as many. Most of them have been completed in the last financial year, 18-19, and the ones completed this year didn't have as high a value. So there has been a slight reduction there. However, on the flip side, what you will see in the Appendix 1 is the increase in a number of assurance work that we are undertaking. We're doing more proactive, getting out and about and looking at services, reviewing the anti-fraud controls, making sure that they are fit for purpose. So just a brief overview there, but happy to take any questions from members.
Thank you, Andy. We've got a question from David.
You give the value, I think you call it the notational value of 536k of fraud identified. What do you reckon the actual amount of fraud is? Clearly, you've got one figure that you know. You've got one figure that you can do that to, and I don't know whether you can see me on screen. You lick your finger and you put your finger up into the air. But clearly, if you are close to it for a while, you know that might be 10%, or it might be 50%, or it might be 80%.
It's a very hard value to calculate, really, in terms of actual fraud. If you look to some of the government agencies, such as the Department for Work and Pension, or some of the Cabinet Office discussions around found fraud, they always look at it, what we identify as purely being the tip of the iceberg. And one of the greatest or hardest things, almost the holy grail, is trying to quantify the unknown. How do we try to ascertain what we are finding in comparison to what's out there? Now, one area, for example, where we probably can give a better estimate is in the area perhaps of tenancy fraud, where we're looking, probably there's been some more analytics done across the United Kingdom, and what we're probably finding there is that tenancy fraud across the whole stock probably runs at about 3.2 to 3.5%. But that's just one area where a lot of research is done. When we look at it holistically across the whole council, I feel that unfortunately it's trying to identify what the unknown is and quantify that as a figure. So I would not like to hazard a guess in what we are identifying. But what I will say, when we get referrals, our success rate is in the region of 1.5, which is 1 to 5, which is comparable across the UK in what local authorities and public sector counter fraud departments find from referrals that are sent through to them.
And just to add to what Andy was saying there, Chair, if I may, very briefly, a couple of years back, Andy did a very good piece of work which set out how we assess the notional values of each of the fraud types, which I'm conscious we have a number of new members of the committee now. So we'll circulate that to you outside of the meeting as well, so you can see how we build that profile of what our assessment of what the notional value of loss or fraud is in each type of case.
And Andy, if I may just sort of jump in there, have we had anything through the new exit interview process? But I've always been banging on about exit interviews in this committee because I think they're a really good, useful source of knowledge for any organisation, but they're also very useful for whistleblowing. Has anything come from that yet?
Nothing's come directly through to us, and actually just sort of pre-COVID, we were in the process of, we'd completed a piece of work working with Debbie in HR in terms of improving the codes of conduct, adding in there about reporting issues where individuals find problems. We've just signed up to a new independent whistleblowing hotline so that members of staff, if they are not particularly comfortable speaking directly to officers within the council, can now speak to an independent hotline where they can provide their information anonymously, and that was one route which we've provided. Unfortunately, COVID then has delayed some of the comms around that, which we hope would have improved members of staff providing information, and not just about fraud, but areas where they have concerns. If, for example, it's about efficiencies within departments, that was the general aim of getting that information across. But I'm not aware, I don't know if Debbie has any comments on that, but I'm not aware of any information that we've received directly linked to fraud referrals that have come from exit interviews.
Oh, no, there aren't any, Andy. But as you say, that the new ability to report independently should be an improvement if staff wish to.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Andy. We've got a couple of questions coming up. Right, Emma, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wondered what your perception was of the importance of, I don't know, of online crime. I know generally that out in the criminal world, we look at our crime stats and think, oh, it's over the years crime's gone down in a lot of areas, not everything, and it's all online fraud, and they don't measure that because they don't measure it, they don't pin it to the place where the victims are, because they don't know whether the perpetrators could be anywhere in the world basically, or they could be in Hammersmith. But that's I just wonder if that can be factored in at all, or if that is an issue of people trying to I don't know how that would work. I don't know how that would work. The other issue, sorry, just about whistleblowing and so on. I'm just talking my experience of 14 years as a counsellor. As people tell Emma, and it's normally bullying that people don't want to tell anybody, and they're not going to tell an independent investigator either. And there's very little I can do actually if they don't want to come forward, because all I can say is, oh, I heard there's been a bit of unpleasantness in the X department, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's very hard. It's very, very hard, and that happens quite a lot because people know me. I've been around a long time. People tell me stuff that goes on, which is difficult. So yeah, online fraud and yeah.
No, that's fine. If I start with online fraud, I think the crux of the matter is the point you made about reporting. Some people are quite embarrassed if they have been hoodwinked or scammed, so the reporting isn't always provided. Unfortunately, a lot of the time that information does get sent through, and there is obviously action fraud, which is a line that goes into City of London Police, who do a lot of work around online fraud. They do try to disrupt. So if information is provided, and we'd always try to reiterate this to people, that if they are caught out for online scams, they do need to report it as soon as possible, because they are doing activities. Unfortunately, it's not always as easy to bring individuals to trial, primarily because a number of individuals are outside the jurisdiction and attacking us from outside the UK. But what they can do, action fraud, if they do get reports, they can act swiftly. They can make sure that relevant sites are closed down. They can also look out for or try to trace where individuals are sending the scams from, or whether or not they're pinging out, almost a scattergun approach of these scammed emails. So, and also in some instances, they will alert the public. I'm sure you've seen during the COVID crisis a number of messages that have gone out and have been disseminated, making people aware of the different types of scams, usually linked to COVID and reporting concerns, have gone out. So hopefully we're starting to get a little bit better in the country. The problem being is that, unfortunately, it's going to take a lot of resource to try and tackle that, and crime in other areas is still ongoing. One sort of area, not necessarily of success, but where we as local authorities can come together has been in the business grant fraud area. So obviously there's been a number of business grants that have been issued, and scam emails have been sent into various councils, business rate departments, pretending to be various different companies, asking for various information, including bank account details, pretending to be those organisations. Collectively, we've come together as local authorities. We have an organisation called the National Anti-Fraud Network, and as soon as we found out that we were being hit by this information is being disseminated out across all local authorities. We in turn are disseminating it to our own officers in business rate departments, so that the information gets there and we're not caught out by it. And that's been fairly successful. So, you know, if we come together and if the reporting is made and we're made aware of the scam, hopefully something can be done. And I think that's the crux of the matter. It's about making public aware that really, if there are issues, if they do get caught out, they need to report that. Now, linking that nicely into reporting, and you mentioned about the whistleblowing area, I suppose what we probably didn't, or I probably didn't get across, is it's not independent investigators. It's actually an independent body, a bit like Crime Stoppers is an example of this type of organisation. That's there. They're not made up of investigators. They're not there to investigate. They're really trained just to empathise and to take the information in the best way possible from the individual, give them that confidence that they can reliably provide information to them, but more importantly, confirm to them that it's completely anonymous. Their information will not be passed on, only the information that's relevant for the investigation. As I said, we had hoped to get some comms out on this prior to COVID. Hopefully, as we start to move back to some areas of BAU, this will be an area that we can sort of disseminate, make staff aware, and happily share with you as we go forward with that, so that I'd be grateful for some of your advice, so we're getting the right messages out to our staff so that they can feel comfortable in reporting information to us.
Thank you, Andy. Next question from Cosette.
I think Debbie wanted to speak on this one. Debbie's hand up.
Is Debbie? Well, I'm going down in order of people who put their hands up, so as not to offend anyone. But Debbie, is this related to this point? And I'll let you jump the queue in front of Cosette.
Thank you very much indeed. It was just to briefly say there are various informal avenues for staff. So we've got health and wellbeing champions trained. If staff are particularly concerned about health and wellbeing, and we've got equality and diversity champions trained in the workplace. So if a member of staff doesn't want to speak to their immediate line manager or HR, there are many avenues where an informal conversation and support can be given. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Maybe I'll have a chat with you when we can speak physically about, honestly, people always come to me, and I've had probably half a dozen over the years. Bullying.
Okay, happy to take that offline.
Thank you. Cosette.
Thank you, Chair. I had a question about going forward, how stats from the independent hotline might be incorporated into this report, and in particular, if there's also any way to share emerging themes from exit interviews, either here or elsewhere in appropriate governance, to pick up any concerns that might arise from that channel.
As you see in the current report, we have some information about whistleblowing in there, and I'm more than happy going forward that we can incorporate the statistics from the independent line. So that will be something we will feed into this report. In terms of exit, it may be something that Debbie may be able to provide you some support on that, or assurance.
So yes, we can supply some themes on what's coming out of exit interviews. So happy to do that going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Andy. That was great, as always. Now, moving on to our last agenda item, which is A13. It's David again, I assume.
Thank you, Chair. As you're aware, and just to make new members to the committee aware, it's very important that when we actually show that we have strong anti-fraud policies that support staff and also ensure that we minimise fraud and corruption against the authority. They're an essential part of governance, and it's important, therefore, that as policies are revised, we bring them to this committee so that members can see the revisions that are being made, and we look to you for your approval. That also gives the report some gravitas. Certainly when we're rolling that out across the organisation, we give them assurances that the reports have come through yourselves and that you have reviewed them and are satisfied with those reports being, or should I say, the policies being rolled out. On this occasion, it's the new strategy document, and the strategy document itself is covering the period 2020 on to 2023. It's based around the national strategy, which is the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally 2020 document, which I have to confess I had a lot of work involved in that and getting it together. I sit on the board, and a lot of the information has come from the work that Kensington and Chelsea do, seen as best practice in some areas, and that has supported the strategy going forward. So our strategy falls in line with that. What is new in terms of the strategy going forward is the action plan. And I think that any strategy, it's very important to have an action plan to detail how we're going to achieve the objectives laid out in the strategy and what we're aiming to achieve. And as we go forward, we will be providing to yourself as a committee our progress in achieving those objectives in accordance with the strategy, how we're achieving the objectives and what the outcomes are from that. So it really is to show you the new strategy document and to get your approval for us to roll this out across the organisation. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. We have no questions, so I assume that's been approved.
Thank you.
Yeah, thumbs up from everyone. And I think that's the last item on the agenda. I've just got a message from my wife whether I'd like my dinner burnt or very burnt. It's jolly lucky we started this at 6. But I thought that was a really good, productive session. Thank you very much to our new member, David, new council member. And very much to our new co-opted members, Liz and Cosette, who really made valuable contribution, and I'm sure will make contributions for years to come. And thank you, of course, very much to the officers for all the hard work they put into getting these reports together. They were of a really high quality today, and you dealt with all our questions and probing extremely well.
Without any waffle, Chair.
Without any waffle. That's what we like.
Yeah, it was very good. Very, very well answered.
You don't get any of that.
Pleasure. Okay, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you very much to Mark.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chair.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Chair.